All right, we should be live. We should be recording. You guys can take a quick sneak peek at this stream. Yeah, I'm gonna do it too because I want to see if it looks good.
Let's see.
Yeah, that looks pretty nice. I'll take it. And if there are any like problems with the information being shown, or if there's any typos, just let me know and I'll fix it live-ish.
Okay.
Okay, so let's do some introductions and get some of the initial information out of the way that we wanted to talk about. My name is Joey. I'm the CEO of Microraptor Games. I've been in the industry for about 10 years or so. I've worked on 3 released games, and I'm here to talk with Ross and Damian about Stop Killing Games because I am kind of a skeptic, hopefully not a flaming, problematic kind of skeptic. You know, I have some issues,
Not,
but who knows? We'll see. We'll see how hot it gets, right?
we wouldn't have made it this far if you were.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
No, you're not. It'll be fine.
that is our goal to have a good faith, discussion, right, and some arguments here.
Yeah, I'm the founder of Stop Killing Games movement and an unofficial organizer for the European Citizens Initiative. Damian is one of the official organizers. So if this is successful, it'll be him going to Brussels to discuss this with the EU Commission. So
I'll smuggle you in.
he's also probably our most technically savvy member of the initiative.
Thank you.
So we have a few developers, but he has long resume and background. So I think the general plan was we were going to have a discussion, but if we stray into any territory, I'm a little less certain of that. He's kind of the fallback for that. So he's the second line of defense here. So.
Yeah, it might also happen during the call that we're talking about something that we don't have a solution to. We're not the legislators. We're not the ones that are drafting the laws, right?
I think that's highly likely.
Yeah, it probably is. Yeah.
We can clarify that. So.
Yeah, I think if we find any potential loopholes or abuse that publishers might perform based on on things that we find, we're trying to identify those so that when the laws and legislature gets written, we can then identify, hey, that's not that's not good enough compared to based on what we talked about or what we discussed, or this is a way that we need to firm it up a bit, right? Or encourage the people who are actually writing this to firm it up a bit.
Hey, but I'm fine with looking into loopholes. That's not a. There's actually a different kind of discussion that I'm normally having, so that's fine.
Oh, really? What kind of discussions do you normally have with people about this?
Explaining it and just people kind of envisioning many different scenarios with how this would work or the process, that sort of thing. Yeah, I guess we should give a little bit of background for your viewers. The European, we're talking about the Stop Killing Games European Citizens Initiative, and at its core, this is initiative proposed to the EU Commission that we're collecting signatures on, where if it's passed in its proposed form, what it would do would require publishers selling video games to leave them in a reasonably working state at the time they end support, and without requiring a further connection to the publisher or that sort of thing. So that it wouldn't allow companies to essentially brick games that they've sold to you once they're done supporting them. Most video games are already compliant with this. This is primarily focused on ones that require an online connection to function when they're being supported. So.
And it's an EU initiative, but I imagine that if it passed, it would probably end up becoming a global standard, since there's no reason why a company would release a version of their server, for instance, after the game is finished just for EU. It would probably end up being global, right?
There might be some fringe scenarios where that could happen, but yeah, by and large, if a publisher knows they have to have an end of life plan when they shut down the game and to sell the game in the EU, they may as well roll it out globally once they shut it down, because they've already done the work at that point. It would just, it would almost be a trivial matter at that point. And the analogy I use a lot is when Australia sued Valve, the Australian Consumer Commission sued Valve over not allowing refunds on Steam. When Valve lost that, they ended up making refunds available not just in Australia, but globally, because they figured we don't want to have to go through this again in other courts. We've already set it up to work this way. We might as well just get it over with. So
Yeah, and similarly with China, with the loot box rates in games, that's pretty much become a standard now that is global. You can see what rates you get for different rarities of items and such.
Oh, I wasn't actually aware of that one.
Yeah, that one's. I mean, loot boxes are a whole different thing. We kind of talked about it briefly in Discord chat privately, right? But yeah, for instance, my company, we're trying to be very ethical, right, and very transparent with our community, and we talk a lot about loot boxes and gambling and such in regards to the ethics. But that's a different discussion, right? That's further down the line.
Yeah, well, I'm personally not a fan of those. We're single issue.
Yep.
We're just trying to stop games from being destroyed with what we're doing.
I mean, but speaking about, this is a pretty heated topic, right? I mean, the moment that you brought it up, and there have been some pretty prolific individuals who have commented on it or reacted to it with varying degrees of, I guess, uncertainty or support.
Yeah, well, it was semi-smooth sailing for many months, because even before the European Citizens Initiative, we were doing the consumer protection action back in April. But yeah, our biggest speed bump on that front has been YouTuber or streamer Pirate Software, who he misunderstood a lot of what we were doing, but I also think that didn't matter, because he was just against it full stop. In the early stream, he was saying stuff like they don't need saving, or I think he said like this is not a problem or something to that extent when I was describing the problem of games being destroyed. His videos, he made at least 4 videos on it, but they've sort of evolved since then. So I'm not actually sure what his stance is on it now, except he is against it. So
I watched his videos.
The exact quote was, sorry about that.
No,
the exact quote
keep going.
was, gaming isn't in need of saving. We turn the servers off, the game dies. It's called the game is no longer profitable. We turn it off. You bought the experience, you experienced it, and then the game was over. Eventually the community dies and we turn the servers off. Those are like direct quotes.
I think to play devil's advocate a bit with him, or to try to understand what he might have meant, I can see cases where there might be games that are live service, they go offline, and there just aren't enough players who have an interest in continuing to play it, that the cost of hosting a server privately would be more than that person who's hosting it would be able to recoup from people wanting to play on that server, and in which case the game is essentially dead, even if it's still available to experience, right?
Well, yeah, in fact, that's a good point, because that is a common point of confusion that we have. We're not advocating companies keep the servers running indefinitely. They can end it whenever they want. It's just we're trying to go for responsible shutdowns. So let's say you did have to connect to the publisher when they were supporting it. Once they end, then they might patch it or release some server code or something along those lines, so that you can continue running it with private hosting, completely separate of the publisher from that point onward, so they don't have to incur any costs. No, I agree. It is not reasonable to keep games hosted indefinitely by the publisher.
Well, even by individuals, right? I mean,
it's the same way. I look at it like, if you have a movie on your shelf, yeah, maybe you haven't watched it in 10 years or 15 years, but maybe a day comes along that you do want to watch it again. It's kind of like that, where, yeah, the game can die. Like any game can die multiplayer game can die in terms of players not being interested in it anymore. We're not, that's just the fact of life. We're not trying to do anything to address that. But what we're trying to do is is to maintain the capacity to play it if you want to, because fine, like you mentioned, the cost of a company hosting the server just might not make sense anymore, and there's only 20 people playing. Well, then they shut it down. But let's say those 20 people get in touch with each other, and then one of them decides they want to host a private server. Well, then they can continue to keep playing the game. And or maybe, maybe somebody, a YouTuber or personality, has an obscure game they want to play, and they can kind of rekindle interest in it if people want to play it. So it's, yeah, we're against we're trying to stop killing the capacity to play the game if you want to.
I think later we'll touch a bit on some games that may not be very possible to run just because of their scale. We'll get to that later, because first I want to kind of go about, I saw recently in the news that The Crew 2, they had released an offline mode for it. And I think they either directly cited your initiative, or was very strongly suggested that it was because of your initiative, right?
Well, it's The Crew 2 and Motorfest, and I don't think they've done it yet, but they said they're going to. And while Ubisoft has made false claims before, to me, this is so overt, I think they plan on following through with it. So I have some faith on that. I'm not aware of them directly referencing our movement, but I think that has to be the case.
Yeah.
Because I think if we had never done this campaign, The Crew would have been just another shutdown on the pile of many other games, and the news would have moved on to something else. But it's not that The Crew is kind of a separate thing we've been doing, where it's an excellent candidate for trying to get various countries to examine if this practice is even legal. So we've did some other action related to reporting it to consumer protection agencies. That's still ongoing. It's not a slam dunk case either way, because it's been stalled months beyond what it normally does, from what I've heard, for I think France and Germany, because it is a complicated issue. This is something the law just wasn't written for, in my opinion. So we're keeping our fingers crossed on that. But the crossfire of that is maybe I have no idea what's going on through Ubisoft's head. On one hand, it could be that they see this, because we have made such an uproar about it, that they see this as an easy PR win, and that, well, we can maybe add offline mode without too much trouble. And if we're getting all this commotion and bad PR press over it, we can do that, maybe get an easy win that'll help our stock price, because we're having some problems there.
Yeah, nowadays they need those PR wins.
Yeah. Or maybe they've gotten word early from these consumer protection agencies that's saying, look, what you're doing is not lawful under French law, and we're going to have a fine or some sort of penalty in the future. And if that's the case, then they might be saying, you know what, why don't we just get ahead of this on The Crew 2 and Motorfest, so that we don't have to have a repeat of this fine in the future. That would be amazing, but I'm not getting my hopes up too much. So it's hard to say where it's coming from.
It's possible.
What they could also be doing is they might just be trying to manage their attention. They've got a lot of fires burning. Maybe they just don't need this problem right now, right?
Yeah, well,
they're going to need some better firefighters then, because right now the whole company.
Yeah. To clarify, we are happy they're doing that. I see it mostly as a bonus, because I was never expecting this to happen voluntarily prior to some sort of ruling from a consumer agency. So the fact that's happening is a great bonus, but it doesn't really impact any of our action. The plans are all still the same.
So yeah, speaking more about the initiative itself, I think probably a large source of the confusion, especially for developers, is defining what you mean by playable. And just to reiterate for people who I've just joined, we're not the legislators, so we're not the ones that have to define that, but knowing what we're trying to achieve here is important, and there's so many different ways we can define playable, and there's so many loopholes I can see of how publishers might do something destructive to their game and still have it be considered playable. So, can you speak a bit about that, and then maybe I can jump in with some of my potential issues or loopholes that I have?
Sure. The reasoning behind that is that it mostly has to do with the whole process of proposing a citizens initiative. The target audience for this is honestly in that initiative is honestly going to be the lawmakers or the EU Commission. So they may know nothing about video games, but they are going to understand like consumer law or things like right to repair or planned obsolescence. But this by saying reasonably playable, that's us trying to give a little bit of wiggle room and compromise to make this easier to go down for the industry. Because say, there's a couple things going on, but say, you have an end of life plan for a game. It's like, say, an arena shooter or something. The game works, you can host the game, connect to other people privately, but then something like matchmaking doesn't work or leaderboards don't work. Well, if we're talking literally, it has to be 100% playable, then that game wouldn't meet the requirements. And we want to be a little more flexible on that because, some features are kind of like bonus tie-in things, like say like integration with social media, like Twitch or Twitter or something. That's not really the core draw of the game usually. So we want to leave that a little bit interpretive to make this more feasible. Now, on the flip side of that, say the game technically runs, you get into the menu, and then you can't start anything. You can't get into a level or anything like that. Well, that would not really meet the criteria of reasonably playable. Like, if a customer bought the game expecting to play it, and then most of the features work, if it has a bug or two, that's understandable. That's kind of normal for the course. But if it's just completely just won't work at all, that's not really gonna meet the criteria. And yes, I agree, that's not a very specific definition, but I'm not sure how you would frame it with a specific definition, because an analogy I made in one of my videos would be like in America, if the police stop you, they have to have reasonable suspicion. And in order to arrest you, they need to have probable cause. Well, those are kind of broad terms also, and common sense kind of has to come into play. And in cases where it's not clear, that's what courts are for. But I'm not sure, like, I guess a good question okay, well, before we get to that, the other reason for framing it that way is let's say we get the signatures, this goes before the EU Commission, well, they're going to be hearing the opposition to this from the industry also saying, no, we can't have any of this. All these changes are unacceptable, blah, blah. So it might get watered down some. So if we start off with the bare minimum that we'd be willing to accept that would still solve the problem, that gives us nowhere to go in terms of negotiations. Whereas this would be excellent. Like if the publishers if they were just required to leave the game in a working state and that's the end of it, then great. But let's say in negotiations they decide, okay, well, this is theoretical. Let's say we can't necessarily guarantee it's in a playable state, but playable or reasonable chance to repair it or something, and they decide that's acceptable. Well, that's still a pretty big win. But so it's partially a negotiating tactic, and part of it is to just try to encompass almost everything problem-wise.
I have a couple of things with that, though, which is...
Yeah, well, the question I was going to ask you is, how would you, if you wanted it more specific, what would you propose? I guess would be a good question.
I think my answer is that I don't know how I could... The thing is, like, just saying reasonably playable to me opens up a lot of problematic doors that people way less ethical than we will absolutely take advantage of. And I think it really comes down to, like, litigation, right? So if, for the instance you used, the example you used, which was the US law of the reasonable suspicion, right, is because it depends on the context. And if somebody disagrees with that usage of reasonable suspicion from the cops, you can sue the state or the county. And that's the taxpayers that front that money. in this case, if for instance a random player says, "Hey, I don't think this falls under my interpretation of reasonable suspicion, or I don't think this is reasonably playable," what happens then? Can the individual sue the company, the publisher, the developer in this case, or how does that start to get brought up within like a court?
I'm actually not sure on the individual suing angle of it. The way I think it would most likely be heard would be, okay, so this game is missing one feature that's kind of minor. I think what people would do is report it to consumer protection agencies, kind of like what we did with The Crew. Or so let's say it's like one thing and it bothers one player who wants the game 100% the same, even though that relied on much bigger servers, but the game's 99% there. They don't care. Okay, they filed their complaint, but if it's just them filing their complaint, that's probably, maybe they might be able to get like a partial refund or something. Or the consumer agency might say, no, this seems to fulfill the requirement. However, in that case I was talking about where, let's say you get into the menu and the game's completely unplayable. Well, now they might be getting hundreds of complaints, in which case they're going to say, okay, yeah, this doesn't meet the requirement because, the game's not playable. This isn't how the game was advertised. Or so it is kind of a spectrum.
I can probably add something to this with regards to loopholes in general. So you're talking about a situation where there's relatively vague wording and then it gets tested. So first of all, we have to think about what happens to the vague wording, right? In the ECI, we talk about the game being reasonably playable, right? This is the statement that the European Union, the government, gets, and they try to figure out how to put this into legislation. They're going to write a few laws, probably, about this, and those will be worded completely differently than
Yes.
Yeah.
what we have written on the Stop Killing Games website and in the European Citizens Initiative. So what's going to happen is there's going to be new laws now, and those are going to be decided on by a group of experts in legislature, a group of people who actually know how computer games work because they are going to hire subject matter experts. They can't legislate about something that they have absolutely no information about. And both courts and legislatures routinely invite subject matter experts um, into processes such as lawsuits, such as creating new laws, and so on. There are people whose job is subject matter expert, legal subject matter expert, and that's actually a recognized position that is very regulated in many countries.
I'd be curious to see who those experts are, because I want to run into a situation like with EA. I think when they were brought, I think it was a UK committee or something, they were brought in to explain how loot boxes weren't gambling, and they said they were surprise mechanics, right?
Yeah, so subject matter experts exist in all sorts of industries. So, for example, my neighbor from 2 years ago was a subject matter expert in building construction, right? If there was a problem with a building, he would show up and he would say, okay, this was done correctly or this was done incorrectly, and this is why. Those are the things that could happen. Someone could die, or maybe like just the paint will keep on peeling off. There could be all sorts of things happening. With regards to games, I don't think there are active subject matter experts in that sort of situation. So the EU will have to figure out how to find someone. They will probably do something like a write-up and invite people to submit their CVs, stuff like that. I honestly don't know how they're going to
The way to look at
find those
this
people.
is anything we submit, it's going to mutate into something else. So what we're putting down the initiative, that's kind of like our guiding star, like a lighthouse to sort of what we're aiming for. Like we want the games to be left in a working state when they shut down, and kind of keep it simple on that, so they know what the general trajectory is and
It's
how that
basically a
manifests
forward.
itself. Yeah, how that manifests itself is we may well, I say we, the Damian and friends will may have some input on that, or it could be the EU Commission just kind of tells us what's going to happen. It's hard
Yeah.
to say. The ultimate decision is going to be in the EU Commission over this.
It'll be interesting to watch
Yeah.
for sure.
And then, okay, let's say we have this legislation in place already, right? And then, as you say, someone's unhappy with what a game company is doing. So let's think about some options of what a game company might do. So let's say you go into Steam, you press play, and all you get is the main menu, right? Like Ross said. The game starts up, the executable is there, you still are being delivered the game, and it spins. It uses your CPU, your GPU. So technically there's a game running there, right? But this is something that would go in front of court, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen those court videos where a guy shows up and starts talking about how he's a sovereign citizen. Those usually don't go very well.
Daryl Brooks or
right?
something.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those don't go very well, right? Those don't go over well. The role of a judge is to weigh out the relative interests of both parties that are suing each other and to come up with a just solution. Not a solution that is, strongly for the consumer or strongly for the corporation. In Europe specifically, judges are there to find a just solution to the problem. And if a company shows up and goes, hey, the main menu works, they're going to be left out of court, and the case will be over in just about 5 minutes.
Well, there's two things with this though, and one of the scariest ones for me is that before the game goes offline, it is fully within the publishers or developers' choice to define what is playable at that moment. I mean, I could remove everything from my game except the main menu on a patch, and then the next day I'll say, oh, sorry, we're also shutting down the servers today. And well, technically the last patch of the game is that, right?
I think the courts would look, I don't think that would last very long in court, because they would look at, okay, well, what was the state when the customer bought the game? I think would be the thing. Let's maybe compare it to that, or it would be seen as a frivolous action. That's the thing. By saying reasonably playable, that's also, that phrase reasonable, while it does make it more broad or less defined, it also is a protection too, because if you just grab a random person off the street and ask, okay, does this game look playable to you? And the character's jumping around shooting things, it's like, yeah, I guess so. But if it's just a menu, it's like, no, I can't do anything, So it's...
Out of curiosity, I mean, how would you think of like Cyberpunk 2077 on release?
That would be a good example of probably a gray area where, see, that's an excellent example of where, like, let's say that was an online only game and then it shut down and then the end of life patch was in that state. I could see that going either way, because you can run around in the world, you can do quests and have gameplay, but this thing is buggy as hell.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the dividing line would be. Is like, well, is this really meet the standard? Yes, no, and it might have to go to a court for that. But the way I see that, even that is a world apart from having absolutely nothing. That's the sort of thing that might inspire community members to see how many bugs they could try to fix, unofficial patches or things like that. But
oh, so it's a Bethesda game now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I before we even see any of the legislature on this, it's just pure speculation on what they're going to write.
Yeah, but no,
yeah.
That's an excellent example of where the dividing line might be, because I couldn't tell you if that was an online only game and that was the end of life build. Does that meet the requirements? I don't know. That would really depend on the judge or the agency involved, because I could see arguments both ways in that scenario, but I wouldn't see them in just get to the main menu and that's it.
Yeah. I think inevitably there will be a need for live service developers or publishers of live service games to have lawyers on retainer, and unfortunately, that will increase development costs, or at least the budgeting, because that will have to go to budget before the
The
game's
big
even
ones
made, right?
probably already do.
They most
Yeah.
likely do. You're right, but this, smaller developers probably won't be able to afford that, and that's just one of the many
No,
points that
I
we might
mean,
talk about.
if they have an end of life plan, I don't think they're going to really need to worry about that. I mean, the people who need lawyers are like the ones, was it like that game The Day Before, or the ones doing major asset flips that are kind of misleading the
Calling the day
public what it.
before a game that's very generous of you.
Yeah, well, they're the ones they're the example of a small developer that might need a lawyer. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Just
If
one.
you just if you have an end of life patch that's that's another thing that maybe I shouldn't even say this, but look, it took a lot of work for us to get the attention of the Consumer Protection Agency. If it's just a couple people complaining, there may not be much happening on it.
Yeah, you're right.
It's when you're going to have to be kind of doing something kind of outrageous to really inspire a lot of people to react, I think.
Yeah, I think the mention of like this, like consumer protection agency, I think is a important buffer here that, if we compare to like the US, right, where, well, an individual could sue the company based on this law, right, directly, and that could more exacerbate it due to frivolous lawsuits and the need to have lawyers on retainer. Whereas with
the U.S. citizens will not be able to sue the companies over this.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, they might get the benefits of an end of life plan, but they're not going to be legally entitled to anything because of how the law set up in the U.S. It's only Europeans Europeans in the EU that would be if this passed. So they would have full protection from the U.S. for sure.
Yeah, that buffer does help to provide some protection against the frivolous lawsuit potential, right?
Yeah, there's also several other protections that companies would benefit from. So first of all, in Europe, very often low claims are forced to first go in front of an arbitration. And when I'm talking about arbitration, it's not, like the US kind of arbitration where a company hires another company to arbitrate on their benefit. In Europe, you have arbitration, which is something like below a small claims court. It's still a sort of loosely government-related agency, but it's something where you go if you have like a really tiny thing to talk about, and then you start over there. And the law is structured in such a way that you actually, in many situations, have to go there. Otherwise, your lawsuit will get thrown out as frivolous because you're using a legal tool that is too heavy-handed to handle a specific case.
Okay.
But then let's say you have this one gamer who goes and says, "Oh, when I bought the game, the main menu was red and now it's green, and I hate this. I want all my money back." Right? Which could be ridiculous, right? It's very similar to a lot of other civil lawsuits that certainly have happened, right? So let's say you buy a house and it's supposed to be clean, but then one of the windows has a stain on it. Like, you go in front of court, you sue the guy who sold you the house because one window had a stain on it that you can wash off in 30 seconds. You're not being taken seriously, right? And not only that, you have to pay the legal costs of the person you sued because it's frivolous, right? So there's a spectrum of, from the company doing something like obviously like evil, like completely degrading the game to where it's not the game anymore, to people being very nitpicky and just coming up with problems.
Yeah.
And
there's a buffer there.
Yeah.
That's good to know that exists. Because I was, I didn't know how it exists in the EU. I'm from the US, and over there, it's just like an individual could sue, and well, yes, it would, the court would probably throw it out and make the person who filed the suit pay for the lawyer costs of the company or the publisher. It would still take time, you're right? You would still have to, the developer would still have to front that money for the lawyers in some cases until the suit was thrown out and that ruling came down.
Well, you could even have that now by, let's say a game was released buggy and some individual says, yeah, I'm going to sue you. You advertised the game was work. That's already a risk if on that
True.
level that you're describing, but I don't think it's an extreme risk, really.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a lot of good information there. I had another one too, and this was something that I didn't fully understand according to the law. So maybe one of you has done more research on that than me. What is the difference between a good and a service in relation to subscription games, which you mentioned would not be part of this law?
Okay, well, it's not just you that doesn't understand that. That is also trying to be determined by multiple
Oh,
consumer
okay.
agencies as we speak. Okay, well, the dividing line, and actually it's looking, I think the EU Commission is actually, we actually asked that direct question to the EU Commission and they dodged it. So
Really?
what they did say, yeah, was, okay, I'll try to give the fast version. If it's something like a digital good, with goods, you pay once, you own them, and that's kind of it. Like it's yours. That people can't take it back. Whereas something like a service, that's something that's being performed, and something could be in your possession. Like let's say you have a rental, like if you rent a car, but you're told or a better example might be something like Netflix, where yeah, you have access to these videos, but then you're told exactly when it ends, like after 30 days or something that you signed up for. Uh, Now, the EU referred to, it was I forget which directive number it was, but they were saying that for games, there was a directive that referred to digital content or digital services. It was something in 2019. And the problem with that is all the references with how they regard to games or other digital services like, digital videos or music or something, it kept referring to the duration of the contract. Well, if we're going by that, then the end user license agreement has no duration, almost like overwhelmingly for these games. It just says they can end at any time. So if there's no stated duration, does that mean it's infinite? Does that mean you have no protections or what? Because it's unclear. It's now in regards to subscription games, that's one where yeah, we're kind of hoping we can get some protection there, but I'm not. Maybe Damian has a different opinion. I'm not counting on it because the subscriptions seem to match the clear definition. Subscription games like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy 14 seem to match a pretty clear definition of a service where, okay, you're allowed to access this game for a finite period of time. You're told exactly when your access ends. So you pay for your month or your 6 months or whatever. That seems like it would comply with both like either digital services or digital content laws, no matter how you slice it. So I'm pessimistic we'll have progress on that front. However, that represents so few games that actually operate that way that I can kind of live with that if we get everything else.
I mean, there's
but
also
not that.
games like RuneScape, right, where you have a free version and you can pay for a subscription as well. And if those would be exempt in some way, I could see some potential abuse of just changing my game to be a subscription model before the end of life, right? And then what happens then?
Well, if you're changing it before, okay, you're talking about if this initiative passed as we
Correct, yeah.
wanted to. So, okay, well, if they're changing it to a subscription before end of life, well, that doesn't invalidate what everybody who bought the game as a good or something resembling a good prior to that. So they could do that, but they would still be liable for everyone else who they sold this game for $60 or something. well, those people still bought it as a good, so they're still entitled to give them the end of life patch. Whereas moving forward, everyone else would be on a subscription after that point. So, I mean, they could do it, but it wouldn't really be in their interest that much.
Yeah, you have to forgive me too. There's somebody vacuuming outside my door right now. If you hear that, sorry about that.
I can't hear anything.
So your
I don't
mic's
hear
good.
anything.
They're right at my door, so yeah,
You have
the
a good mic.
Balrog is here.
Hey, don't worry about it. So with
Okay.
regards to live services, I mean, again, none of us are setting the legislation here, right? And even within Stop Killing Games, there's a wide variety of opinions on this because we're not one hive mind. We have our own opinions. We are a group of volunteers, and we have different opinions, right? Because that's a typical democratic setup where there's a variety of opinions coming together for one cause. So some people are of the opinion that live service games should be completely exempt. If you buy something within the live service game, then you know that this live service game will be exempt, and whatever you're buying, even if it's like $100,000, doesn't matter. Your loss. You knew what you were buying into, and that's it. And then on the other end of the spectrum are people who say, okay, well, I paid for something, I paid for an item, I would like to still be able to use it. So for example, give you a really simple example, right? Let's say I play something like Apex Legends, right? With Apex Legends, I can buy really expensive skins and just cosmetic items, which sometimes can cost up to $300, $500
Jesus.
to get, right? With Apex Legends, the normal gameplay is you go on a map with 60 other people, you shoot each other, and then the game is over, right? It can be difficult to find 60 people, but even post shutdown, there are massive discords for Apex Legends, and they're not going to die out. There's always going to be like 60 people to find, right? So it would make sense for this game to continue having servers available for those people who want to make their own fun. And then there are people who make their own fun with Apex Legends just by going into the firing range and doing like a lot of movement and grappling around the map and
Okay,
just doing that
sorry
sort
to
of
cut
stuff,
you
right?
off. It sounds like you're kind of veering off to a different topic here.
Well, I'm just trying to get to the items
Yeah,
that are
just
that are
checking. I was
that
like,
are
wait a
being
minute, what's
purchased,
happening?
right? I'm just trying to give some
Okay,
context
okay,
here.
sorry.
So the context is that people make their own fun with this game in various different ways, and a lot of people just go into the firing range, do some fun stuff over there, and they would like to see those items in there. And if one person can on their own find value in having those items still available, then some people say that those items should continue to be available in perpetuity, right? So there's a wide variety of opinions here.
Well, yeah, I mean, what somebody, like you said with the in-app, I mean, and I think Ross, you mentioned that if a game, went offline and they removed the in-game store, well, now what you're saying, Damian, is that, well, some people would consider it value, the value is being there if they can access the things that they purchased previously, but that's really hard to guarantee because that would require a release of database and, in some cases, personal information to the public when the game finishes its end of life. And so that seems a bit difficult to ensure that people have access to those purchases.
The point I wanted to get to was I wasn't what people's opinions are only has so much weight. It's more about what the law says.
Yeah.
And I was trying to frame it and the law doesn't really, the law is primarily going to be looking at how these games are sold. Like, so if the license agreement says it ends after 30 days or something, that's pretty clear. But if it doesn't say any of that, it's kind of in no man's land. And Damian kind of mixed in a little bit of another topic with the microtransactions. Well, that's where it falls in because this is one where it is unclear to us how it might be decided. But say you have microtransactions in a game that's already a paid service, like or paid subscription, like World of Warcraft. Well, that might be viewed as just kind of a service upgrade, because even if you bought like a better horse or something, well, your access is still lost after those 30 days or whatever that you paid for. So that could be still fall under the service umbrella, roughly. Whereas, say it's a free-to-play game, well, then you're not being given an expiration date. It's just they're saying we can shut it down whenever we want. Well, even though the game is free, so yeah, that's another thing we want to clarify. None of this would apply to any games that are completely free. So I think Realm of the Mad God is an example of that, where it's just free.
Well, there's also
not,
examples of games that have cost you premium and then gone free to play later. And
Yeah,
what happens in that case too?
well, that's a little different, but I guess we can get to that. But for free to play, now that you've spent money on that game item, and that's a one-time purchase without a stated expiration date, well, that's going to look more like a good under the law than a service. Because if it was a service, well, almost every service you're informed when the service ends.
Yeah.
So that might be, and it's not that you're still technically probably would not be entitled to that free to play game if they wanted to shut it down. But if you bought features in the game, well, then you need the game in order to access them. And that it's kind of a possible backdoor to getting free to play games saved also. But again, that's going to be another area where the EU is going to have to interpret what they think makes sense. But I was trying to frame it from a legal perspective, because because a bunch of people think this should happen, that's probably not going to sway the EU too much. It's going to be looking more at what the law says and how this might fit into it.
I think what it comes down to is that what is a good and what is a service in regards to video games will have to be defined legally, probably in order to solve this this initiative, right?
Maybe, because that's kind of what that one directive was trying to do with about digital content and services. The problem is it still missed the mark for games like this and just didn't cover it, because it kept referring to stated duration date or stated contract duration, and there is none. So it's going to have to probably clarify that element of games like this that are sold, one-time purchase or microtransactions, but no stated duration date.
I mean, so
it is probably going to have to.
If a game has that duration date, right, that says our game servers will shut down at X date, and you know that when you purchase the game, right? So like 2 years from now, this game will be offline.
Right.
Is that something that would be okay? Like the customer knows, they're buying into it, knowing that that's when that service ends. Is that part of the initiative, or do we not know yet?
That's something where a few thoughts on that, and maybe Damian has thought also, but that's something where I personally just want to see the game saved, and that wouldn't be enough to do that. However, that would better inform consumers. Plus, the other thing is companies are not going to want to do that for multiple reasons. One, let's say the game's a flop and no one's like Concord is a recent example of that. Well, they don't want to be on the hook for saying this game is going to last 2 years or whatever, because that's cost to run the servers when they're just losing money. So, however, let's say the game's a complete hit. Well, then they don't want to say that it's going down at this time and then have to switch to they don't want to have to charge all existing players renewal fees in order to do this. So it's...
Well, they could extend the EULA so that when you start the game, you have to sign the new one that says, well, we've added some more time to this expiration date, right?
Yeah, I guess the other element of that is they do not want to put in writing that the game's going to expire then, because I think that's going to hurt sales, and that will wake people up psychologically in a way other warnings wouldn't. Because, if you buy milk and it says it expires at this date, that's pretty clear. But if you just buy milk and then it doesn't say when it expires, we think, well, maybe you have a few days, maybe it's a week. I don't know. It doesn't discourage it leads to more informed consumers, which tends to work against the games industry in this issue.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I use a permanent marker to write a new date on the milk, and it seems to work just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do
So
that.
there's with regards to perpetually renewing licenses like that. So let's say you buy a game or you just play a game, and the game says this game is going to run for the next day, and then on the next day it says it's gonna run for one more day, and so on and so forth. If you go to court with that, you're gonna get laughed out as a company, right? But there are also, with regards to contract durations and stuff like that, there are protections for consumers and for private persons put in place. So, for example, where I live in Austria, if you have a contract where you are renting a flat and the flat is rented on a contract that where inside the contract it says the contract duration is 1 year, then that is by law an illegal clause, and that clause gets erased, and at this point that contract is viewed as a perpetual contract with no end duration, which is a completely different set of laws applying to the contract than a contract where it says this contract expires in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So this, I understand, was created because of an amount of unscrupulous landlords renting out flats for a very short time so that they could hike rent later on. And this is an example of where contract durations have protections for the consumer. So who knows, if companies start doing that sort of thing, well, then, a protection might be put in place for contract durations on things that you buy online.
Yeah, I think that this is I don't know, this is over my head, right? Is how do we define a service in regards to a game? And you could argue that the game itself is a service platform for goods. In which case, well, you have a right to the goods as long as the service is being provided, or you have signed up for the service. So the moment that the game dies, the service ends, and you don't have access to goods anymore. I'm not really sure.
It's not just you that's confused about. We've had literal government agencies I think one in Germany said there is no clear legal regulation on this when we brought that up with them. It's the sort of thing where we're just gonna have to kind of keep our fingers crossed what they interpret that as, and that actually might happen independent of the citizens initiative.
Yeah.
But the EU law also tends to give some backing to having fair terms for the consumer. And if you're not being told when it ends and it can end at any time, that's probably not going to be seen as fair by many lawmakers or consumer agencies. That, you need to, if you're going to cut it off, then you need to inform customers when that's happened or a reasonable expectation of that. But I'm kind of hoping it doesn't get too much into the weeds with our initiative on that. That's why I don't think we even listed anything about that in the initiative. We're trying to aim for just have the game in a playable state so we can just we can sidestep this entirely, hopefully.
Yeah. Another thing that was kind of similarly, it's kind of similar. This targets primarily, we're talking about, I guess, like PC games in here, but there's also mobile, handheld, and console games. And do you know how the initiative might target these, if it targets them at all?
Well, I brought that one up in the video frequently asked questions I did.
Yeah.
I think in that case, it gets. I mean, I'm kind of speculating here what the EU would decide, but what makes the most sense to me that I think they might fall on is have because let's say it's a game where the server literally can't run on like the console or the mobile device. Well, I think as long as they're have like an available download where you can host that server somewhere, and then you can redirect where the mobile game or the console game is pointing towards, I think that would have to be the solution for games where it's not doable to kind of patch it in. But consoles get tricky in particular, I think, because I'm not even sure now. Don't some of them charge for you to basically have internet access through the console?
They
PlayStation does.
also Nintendo, the Switch.
Nintendo as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Xbox doesn't.
Yeah, I think what I think would happen would be that the drew a blank for a second. Oh yeah, okay. So as long as the game publisher isn't preventing you from accessing the game, and the console maker, you're paying your fee to the console maker to access the internet, that probably would be acceptable. Although maybe the console maker sees that as a security risk because now it's just out in the wild with what it's connecting to, and they want to keep a more locked down ecosystem on that. In which case, maybe they could stall that until the console maker discontinued it. I'm not sure. That is a thorny issue to work out, which is exactly why we had it worded broadly the way we did. But
I see an issue because I know like certain stuff with Sony console certification, and they have some pretty big security requirements. I imagine that if you could host your own server for, let's just say, a console game right on the PS5 or something, or even on Android, it's pretty similar. You would have to be able to target an IP of where the server is, this is usually baked into the APK on Android or into the game build on consoles, is to target those handshake servers and the game servers itself, and you would have to be able to retarget that. Android, you could, of course, modify the APK and rebuild it. Console games, though, I don't see Sony ever allowing that because it's too much of a security risk for games, potentially.
So I can imagine a few technical solutions for what we are talking about here. So first of all, let's get rid of all the games where there's just like a phone home check, right? It just checks if you're online.
Yeah.
Like those are trivially easy to patch away so that you can still start the game, right? Or things like, the crew, which has a multiplayer element, which is not important for the gameplay, right? It's secondary to the main gameplay. It can be patched away. You don't need that to play the single player
that's a
component,
subjective thing.
right?
I mean, it's
Yeah, it is. I
but
agree with that.
there's been, well, actually, I'm wondering, okay, well, I'll let you go and then I'll bring.
So
Sorry.
let me just finish and let's
sorry.
go to you. Okay, so then we have games which actually have servers, which are actually like a useful component, like an active component of the gameplay, right? So you have a server hosting a multiplayer map, or a server which hosts, shared state between clients, being
Physics processing.
We can use
single
like
player games.
Planetside
Yeah.
2 as an example, right? It has no offline, no bots, so you have to play it with other people. You have to connect to a server, right?
Didn't like
Yeah.
Crackdown have physics processing on server?
Yeah,
there are a lot of
and
games that do that, yeah.
Titanfall 1 did too, right? Titanfall 1 did a lot of the physics processing on the servers because the Xbox 360 just wasn't fast
Yeah,
enough.
that's the only way that you can actually handle the the game's multiplayer elements and all the calculations is to let the more powerful server handle it and just replicate the results in the client.
Yep. So there are a few ways to solve this technically, right? So first of all, you nowadays all consoles are based on the Intel architecture, and that's the same architecture as the servers are running as well. So there is very little stopping people from running virtualized processes of the server on the console itself. You would have to have the ability to run a VM on the console, but technically, according to the hardware that's on the consoles right now,
Well,
technically
I think
it is
Switch
possible.
on Android. Switch is on ARM, isn't it?
Switch is on ARM.
Well, I
Yes,
mean, running a
that is true.
virtualized environment on a console. I mean, were you talking about like jailbreaking the console to run the server?
No, we are talking about where the game developer would add functionality where the game itself starts a VM on the console, and then this VM runs the server.
So
And
it's
then
a
that's your
dedicated
server.
server run on the. I think Warhawk on the PS3 had that. You could actually choose to play the game or host a dedicated server for other people to
Yep.
join, and you couldn't do both at the same time.
Yeah, you couldn't. But nowadays with the multiprocessing available on modern consoles, there's no issue with
It
doing that as well.
depends on the game though, and
I agree.
we'll get to that.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's just one solution. The next solution could be where, let's say you're paying for PlayStation Plus, right? For online gaming, right? So PlayStation might go and say, okay, well, if games are being shut down, we're going to offer to you a service now where you can just tell us to start a VM in the cloud, and then you have your dedicated server. It's available for this amount of time, and then you get charged for it, right? Or maybe it's within your PS Plus subscription because you bought like the highest tier, which is the most expensive, right? Because it has multiple tiers. So that's the second option. The third option is, as was said, you get a download and then you can host it on a PC somewhere, right? The next option is integrating part of the dedicated server into the executable, which sometimes can be done because very often game engines are written in such a way that you can run both at the same time within the same process. There's a multitude of options here, and
Well,
it would have to be like a very specific Goldilocks situation to where you couldn't choose at least one of them.
I have a question based on what you said. What about okay, say the scenario where you can't run the server on the console, it's too problematic, but you can run on a PC or custom server. What would there be a security risk in having it point for the console itself? Like what he was talking about with Sony not allowing that, where you're pointing to another IP, but because you're doing that, somebody wants to pack in that server with malware, and then that'll work its way back into the PlayStation OS or something. So Sony wants to ban that. Would there be a workaround to keep the consoles secure from that? Or
Yeah, okay. So we're talking about a situation where I bought a game, it got shut down, the game requires a server. I don't have a server, but someone else is running a server, and I want to connect to it.
right.
Yes, in that case, there is the possibility of the person running the server exploiting an unknown vulnerability in the game that hasn't been patched before the game got shut down. However, there are options around this as well, technological options, such as packet inspection firewalls, which look at packets coming into your system. And then they go and say, oh, this packet is something I haven't seen before. I don't want it. And if you're being sent an exploit with this packet, then the firewall stops it. Obviously, that's software that needs to be developed. But if consoles wanted to enable this mode of operation, then that would be something that they could develop. And it's not something that would be extremely difficult to develop, but it would obviously require some considerable effort. On the other hand, as a consumer, if you are connecting to a third-party server, then that liability is on you. It's not on the game developer, publisher, it's not on Sony, it's not on your internet service provider, it's solely on you because you are the person who decided to connect there, right?
I don't agree with that. Just from what
Okay, go on.
and I could be wrong, but from what I know with Sony certification, if that has that enabled, not only does it affect the rating of the game, but it would have to be tested, and that it's pretty rigorous. And if there are those potential for vulnerabilities, they would not pass you for certification for that build, and you could not go live with that build. I could be wrong on that though.
Okay, well, that's an interesting thing to think about. And
Well, you mentioned earlier for VM, would it be possible to have the client run in a, would running the client in a VM potentially protect the like if you want to connect to some random server, would that potentially connect the software for like the PlayStation if something
Yeah.
bad did go
So
through, or?
right. So I don't know how it is with PlayStation 5, but with Xbox, every single game runs on a VM. That's why they also have the quick resume function. Every game is by default run inside a virtual machine. Now, obviously, there are always hacks that happen where you can break out of a virtual machine. They happen, right? They're not 100% impossible because no software is 100% secure. That said, VM breakout bugs are extremely profitable, and it would be very, very stupid of someone to take a bug like this that they could do a lot of damage with and use it to hack Xbox consoles, which, have someone's Xbox cloud login, and that's it. They don't even store your PayPal information. So what are they gonna benefit from
They're
that?
gonna
Like
ransomware
the
your achievement score.
yeah, something like that. I mean,
To
the
get you banned from some
with
servers.
security, you always have to think about what is the probable scenario here rather than what is technically achievable, because technically you can achieve just about anything, but if it's probable or not is a completely different question, right?
Yeah, you're right. And games like Apex we talked about, they have, the kernel level anti-cheat, and they offer a significant amount of money to people who can show how to replicate bugs that, you know, create vulnerabilities. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and yet still Apex Legends itself, even though it is certified, as you say, via Sony, because it is on PlayStation 4 and 5, right? It's certified. It has kernel level anti-cheat. They have anti-cheat provisions on the cloud side as well, and they have all sorts of other protections. Yet still, someone was able to hack into the client remotely, and while TSM Imperial Hall was playing in Riyadh, I think, or there was some other recent event. There was like some sort of championship that was online. He was streaming, and it was a championship. And while he was streaming, someone hacked into his computer via an exploit within the Apex Legends executable, and was able to display a fake, like a cheat user interface that had like stupid jokes about his name on it and a few buttons that made it look like he's wall hacking or whatever. But obviously no one puts into question that the guy was cheating, because he wasn't. Like, he's the highest skilled player probably in the history of the game. But someone was able to hack a game that connects to EA servers. They were able to hack the cloud, and then from the cloud connect to his client, and then via his client they were able to download an executable onto his computer and execute it and display a window on his screen. So even though you can have all sorts of certifications and provisions, information security is still extremely important, and it's very easy to run afoul of this. So I wouldn't say that creating downloadable dedicated servers is particularly a very interesting way to hack people, especially if they're on console.
But there's still an increased vulnerability compared to the general trust, I guess, that you give to a larger company that has kind of that pedigree in some cases.
Yeah, yes. And you have to be aware of this,
Yeah.
right? Like, if you're connecting to someone else's server, you have to know what I'm doing here might be dangerous. Maybe I should be hosting this myself.
If
Maybe I should be hosting this with a company that specializes in hosting servers. There are companies
if
that specialize with hosting specific technologies, right?
if this initiative went through, this would probably motivate Sony to basically work out a solution with the developers making these online only games for their end of life plans for I don't know. This is a little bit beyond my level, but that would motivate Sony to be more invested in the security, knowing that there's going to have to be an end of life plan for it. That it sounds like if it's in a virtual machine, that's going to do a lot to protect things. But
Yeah, I also
Well,
don't know what it looks like behind the scenes for that.
so let me put it this way, right? Titanfall 1 requires servers to be playable because the physics are on server side. It was completely abandoned by Respawn. No one's working on it, no one's updating it,
it's a
nothing like that.
perfect.
And yet they don't even have anyone working on the servers, and yet you can still launch a game on Xbox because of the way that game servers are structured on console, which is very often the game servers run on the infrastructure of the console company. So Titanfall servers run on Azure services, and Azure services are Microsoft's version of Google Cloud or AWS, Amazon Web Services. And they just set up a server image that can be spawned by Xbox's cloud anytime there's a client, and Xbox does it for them, and they don't even have to touch it anymore. So, as you're saying, PlayStation or Xbox might work out a solution, and what they are doing right now with the servers is like 99% of the solution already, because they already have the servers on their cloud most of the time.
That's
Well,
an excellent example because a completely abandoned multiplayer game that's still running. I think I have heard that Titanfall 1 has a bunch of hacks and cheaters on it and stuff like that. So that's probably a pretty good analogy to what a dead game or decommissioned game server running privately would look like is Titanfall 1 on Xbox 360.
Yeah, so now you can think about, okay, so we have this abandoned game, and there's a server and a client, which both have exploits for them, right? So what happens next? Well, what happens normally with communities like that is people start kind of filtering the community, right? That's what happened with Counter-Strike, right? People had community servers that you had to log
No,
into.
I
sometimes.
wasn't. I meant strictly from a
Sometimes.
security perspective. That's all I meant.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is, even the security perspective, like there's the option for the community to organize and have some sort of trust
Yeah,
level,
I think that's kind of a
right?
weaker argument because, okay, let's say I accidentally click and connect to the one that's infested with malware. It's no,
Yeah.
no. I meant like liability for like Microsoft or
Yeah,
Sony
yeah.
for impacting the rest of the
Yeah.
console. The fact that it's basically abandoned anyway, that's a great kind of test study.
I mean, I'm sure some wild new possibilities are gonna spawn from it if this goes through and things like that are put into place. So we can only speculate on that. I think that the quality of self-hosted or community-hosted servers is. I don't really know if it's something that we should get into. I mean, I don't really know if it has much
Our
to do with the initiative necessarily.
I was gonna say our initiative is independent of the quality of the
Yeah.
game.
Like, I mean,
So
that's a good thing is like hackers and do people want to be paying for a private server to have somebody else host it, even though they weren't paying for the game originally because it was hosted by the developers. That's a whole
well,
separate thing in my opinion.
see, that's the customer's choice then, and by that
Yeah,
point, the publisher is out of the picture anyway. They're done with it.
yeah,
So I'm not too concerned about
the
that.
same. Yeah, that's just a
There's
different thing.
there's one thing that needs to be said though, which is that those self-hosted servers will not necessarily be like, worse than the official hosted servers. Because if you turn on Apex Legends right now, it will take you like about 10 minutes until you're getting shot by a hacker, right? And that's official servers on the most popular, highest grossing live service game that's currently available.
There's no game that's
And
solved botting or hacking perfectly, and certainly is not going to happen on a privately hosted server for somebody who doesn't know how to integrate better security solutions in a lot of cases.
Yeah, definitely the solution here is not technological. I think it's sociological. Just, if you figure out someone's hacking, just ban them from your server.
Also, I mean,
Then they
that's a
don't come back.
publicly hosted
Right.
community server, right? That doesn't even speak to people hosting it, just whitelisting IPs for their friends.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this does kind of bring me to probably a bigger point that we'll get pretty deep into, is the legality of releasing source code and server assets. Just licensing an IP as a whole thing, right? It's like, well, you can release server code, you can release a server binary, but you still don't own it as a player. And in which case, that's still the IP of the company making it. They could revoke your right to host a community server at any time.
Well, that's a couple of things. One, if you're going just by what's in the license agreements, and many of these, you don't even own the client. Like, even though they're giving it to you, the EULA says, like, yeah, and the Cruise case, I've looked at that EULA a bunch. It says you're required to destroy all existing copies of the game once they terminate it.
Jesus.
So I wouldn't even worry about that too much. Well, for two reasons. One, what we're asking for is, again, what we're aiming for with our kind of guiding star here is the game left in a functional state. We're not mandating exactly how that is done, because once you start doing that, then you start tripping some wires, like you were discussing, saying, well, no, you have to release the source code, you have to release the binaries. That could trip up some copyright law or other agreements. However, so that's one element of it. The other element, and I'm drawing a blank again, I just had it. It's not enough. Okay, so, yeah, these are license agreements and they can't precede statutory consumer rights or like what the law says. So, I mean, you could write up a license agreement that says, like, you have to give your firstborn child up, as part of the agreement. Well, that's not going to be enforceable, and it's not going to override law, so that's basically nullified.
And the Crew is pretty extreme, but there's still a case of, if we define playable as you get to, go into the game and play something, even if it's solo, even for a multiplayer game, right? Well, there are cases where that game needs to be played with other people in order to actually be considered functional, in my opinion. A game like Planetside 2 or whatever, right?
I think I say reasonably playable.
Yeah.
Well, if the entire history of the game was marketed as a multiplayer game, and in general, everyone who's familiar with the game agrees this doesn't have much going for it as a solo experience, well, then multiplayer in some fashion would be expected from that for games of that nature.
And if this private server, for instance, this dedicated server, and we'll get into this later, I think, but like EVE Online or Star Citizen, right, which is, they cannot be run on consumer infrastructure. They're just not built like that. These games are impossible to run on the consumer hardware. How do we make this playable? And if this is still the IP of the company and they don't want to give the right for people to monetize servers, even if it costs money to host this the server and a lot of it, it's like we're almost touching on IP laws at the same time that we would be requiring games to be playable.
Really, it's not until we get as long as we're not specifically asking for the source code or the binaries as part of the initiative, which we're not. It's a bit of a paradox.
What if a game needed that? What if it required that?
Okay, but here's what I'm getting at. It's a bit of a paradox in that the customer is not entitled to any specific files. What we're asking for is that they're entitled to a working game. However, the working game is going to require some files. But see, once you start mandating specific files, then you are actually clashing against probably other laws and stuff like that. So it's a little counterintuitive, but this keeps it in the safe zone, that if you're just focusing on the end result, like one analogy I made is, let's say you're required to stop a car at a stop sign. Well, most people are just going to use their brakes, but you don't have to use your brakes. Your regular brakes. You could use your handbrake, or you could just coast along and time it so it stops by friction at there, or you could just do something with your tires to kind of screech to a stop. We're not mandating how they stop at that stop sign. We're just saying they have to stop at that stop sign. But to get to your point about the larger games that just can't be run on consumer hardware, I think this is an area where it's gonna have to depend on what the EU says, because on one interpretation, they might say they don't care, in which case the customer still needs to have a working build of the game. What would have to happen in those scenarios is that this would be more work for the developer, and it's not what we're advocating for necessarily. They would have to kind of strip it down to a version that could run on consumer hardware. And that, so like EVE Online, okay, well now you can't have tens of thousands of players. You can only have 100
Well,
or something.
that's not even
one
possible
option.
with EVE Online, right? I mean, because it uses custom built servers and architecture. Like they actually made
would
their
have
own
to-
architecture for this.
This is not, okay, I'm just going through the options.
Okay.
A second possibility is that they say, okay, for games of this that they just can't run on normal consumer hardware, maybe this is an example. I talked about compromises before, that they decide, okay, they're going to say, you're asking for a working state of the game, but the industry is saying some games just can't comply with this. So we might allow like a reasonable chance to repair the game, in which case they would provide the equivalent of repair instructions. So let's say they don't release, let's say this can't work on the consumer hardware, or they release repair instructions, or they release a version of it that can run, but not on the consumer hardware. So I don't know what hardware EVE Online uses, some server shards or something.
Yeah.
Let's say they decide, okay, we're shutting it down, but we're going to release the server binaries, and those will run on these will not run on like x86 machines or something. They're going to run on specialty server racks. And if you want to run the game, go ahead, but we're done with it. That could be another thing. But all these decisions are all going to come from the EU that mandate how this will flow. That's why we're kind of aiming high when we're asking for a playable build, so that knowing this might need to get chopped down a little bit. And if Damian, you want to hop in on any of this, go ahead.
Oh yeah, definitely. I have a lot to say about this.
Yeah. Okay.
So, first of all, it's really impossible to imagine servers nowadays that couldn't run on consumer hardware. This is because, and this is in part due to how Google set up their business, server infrastructure used to be high performance, very special, very unique hardware. You know, they were so different from a normal desktop like a PlayStation 3 was, right?
Yeah, with the
So
cell
you had
architecture.
like Spark, Alpha, you know, stuff like that. All sorts of weird machines running the server. You had big mainframes. Nowadays you don't. Nowadays what you have in the rack is basically like a higher power version of a desktop. And now we have to think about the progression of time here, because that's really crucial to understand this. So with a normal server, like say Apex Legends, or you know, any sort of like normal small scale multiplayer game where you just have a few players on the server, right?
Mm-hmm.
This server will run on the cheapest, lowest level possible virtual machine in Google Cloud Platform or on AWS, because that's the number one cost that those developers need to scale.
Yeah.
Their AWS costs are the number one OPEX. Now, when they are doing that, what they are running the server on is equivalent to one or maybe even one half CPU core on a normal gaming system. That's what the server runs on. It's absolute garbage, right? Okay, but then let's say we're not talking about those like games that have like those tiny servers that are highly efficiency optimized so that they incur the least running cost. Let's go to EVE Online, right? Huge servers, massive. All right, so EVE Online used to run on Lenovo X880 servers. Lenovo X880 servers use Intel i7 8800 processors. Now, I'm not sure if you know what that is, but this is a processor that's maybe by now 10 years old, 15 years old. This by now is also absolute garbage. This is
But it's less about the
incomparably slow.
processor capabilities and about the server architecture, which is how they merge these shards and these multiple processes to create that persistent world and to handle people at any number of people at any point in the universe at any time, right?
Exactly. So now we're talking about not about the architecture of the hardware itself, because we have that covered now, because we know that the hardware is on comparable levels. We're talking about the software architecture, which is the architecture of the cloud itself, right? So we're talking about how different server processes talk to each other when they are on separate pieces of hardware. There's still nothing stopping you from having just as many pieces of hardware running for yourself and having those processes communicating with it. If you would like to run an EVE Online cluster of servers, an EVE Online cloud infrastructure, technically there's nothing stopping you from that.
Sure. But the
Only
question
just
becomes,
how much money do you want to spend
yes.
on having this sort of fun?
And
right?
inevitably, there's might be some whales out there that can afford that, but in a lot of cases, those community servers are probably are going to want to recuperate costs, right? They have a Patreon, pay me $10, I'll whitelist your IP, no problem, right? But then that kind of comes back to the licensing and IP, where, well, they're not allowed to monetize somebody else's intellectual property, in which case they are in this case.
Yeah. So this is a question of, how is this going to work? And I would say that's an interesting kind of case study for how can the developer make sure that the game is still playable for the consumer, while also not losing control of their IP. Interesting conversation.
Hopefully one that can be had with actual network engineers who maybe have worked on Eve or Star Citizen, because that's not me.
I'd say even the most restrictive interpretation would still be a win, because let's say you cannot monetize 1 cent over this game if you're going to run the server. So that means everybody running that server, they have to eat the cost on it. Some people would still do it.
Yeah.
It's like, so
it.
I think even the most restrictive interpretation was leagues ahead of where we are now. So.
Though let's say that 500 people are still playing a game at the time that the servers are taken offline for a game that was premium purchased, right? They pay $20, they can play the game online with other people. There are probably going to be a much smaller percentage of those 500 people that would continue playing if they had to pay monthly now for a server that somebody else was hosting. And who knows where that is around the world, right? That could be in some completely different continent where the latency would just be, it would make the game unplayable, right?
Yeah, we're not, look,
but that's not to do with
I think that
yeah.
comes back to I think that comes back to like the quality of the experience.
Yeah.
I mean, we're focused on not preventing people. If somebody is just a diehard and they want to run that game and they're willing to jump through these hoops, that's what we're trying to stop from being prevented.
I agree.
The game experience for online only games usually is better, even for games that do end up having end of life plans where it's just a few people or the emulator isn't as good for ones that get them. So there is an incentive for the company to keep going, but we understand it's not realistic for them to go on forever, so, and I think most people understand that when you don't have a big major company backing it, running servers, giving support, throwing resources at it, yeah, the quality of the experience could be rougher. So that's...
Yeah, I think both sides of that equation do need to just be voiced so that players can know that they're not going to get the exact same experience, and this is what it's going to feel like if this game ends its life.
That's why it's reasonably playable, not perfectly playable, right? That's exactly
Exactly.
it. But once those community servers start popping up, maybe the experience will be a little bit rougher, but it's also going to be scrappier.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, this is when the game has its golden age, because the community becomes so small that everyone knows each other and they like each other. And if you have a game like EVE Online that has hundreds of thousands of players at any moment in time, and you're telling me that at some point in time it gets shut down because there's only 500 players playing it anymore, I can 100% assure you all those 500 are true believers. They log on 9 a.m. every day and play it for at least 16 hours a day, at least, right? That's 500 diehards who
Yeah,
will never let go of their game.
it's hard to consider
Right?
Eve ever actually dying, but
No,
there are
it's
plenty of
impossible.
MMO games. I'm sure we've all seen Josh Strife Hayes cover his all of those MMOs that just there's like 2 people online, and it's sad that they get
Yeah, I
shut
mean,
down, but who's gonna end up paying for that,
there are,
right?
there are those beautiful videos where people go, even in World of Warcraft, which is currently active. They just go to areas that people don't go to anymore, and they just explore them and look at what they look like and how cool they are when there's just no one out there, and it's just kind of eerie, but it's also kind of cool. And it's like a separate genre of videos about games that are still online, but the population has died out so much that it's like that.
Goes
It's like
south.
those zombie movies,
Well,
right?
it's like
It's like those
exploring
zombie movies where
abandoned
you're
malls
like
that
the
are gonna
last
close.
person. Yeah, it's kind
Yeah.
of like exactly something like that. Yeah. So people make their own fun with just being on their own, and they shouldn't be stopped from that. And I think that's really important for people to understand. Like, if you're trying to tell me that I need to have 100,000 people online to have fun, well, no, I don't. I was watching Asmongold just earlier today, and he in turn was watching a review of um what's it called? Uh Space Marine 2?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Space Marine 2. The video was called This Is What We Lost. And the guy who made that video said that a lot of the time he'll be in those levels and he'll just be, just walking around looking up and down and not really even fighting the enemies because he already killed them. He'll just walk around and look at how cool all of this works and how it looks and how the design and the atmosphere and just how cool it is. And he'll spend half an hour just walking around the level just like that. You know? People can have fun with this, and a lot of people buy games just for that. Not because they want to be a trader or they want to win a galaxy in EVE Online or whatever.
yeah.
They
I
just want to
haven't
look
played
at
it.
cool stuff.
I haven't played it, but and I've heard everybody say it's bad, but I am curious about the game Anthem because it has all these canyons and waterfalls and lush vegetation and aliens. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe I could go in there with low expectations and just see what I like about this world, that sort of
Well,
thing.
you also, I mean, we've talked a lot about Ubisoft, and I think that's yeah, of the unethical publishers that exist in the gaming sphere, Ubisoft is certainly in the top 3 for running, isn't it? And they spend a lot of money on making
Ubisoft's a
beautiful
target.
worlds.
I was going to say Ubisoft is a target of convenience, is what they are. Because, look, a bunch of companies do this sort of thing, like Blizzard, Activision,
Mm-hmm.
EA. I think, yeah, Bethesda has Fallout 76. I don't know if they have an end of life plan for that. So the thing is, Ubisoft, they were a French company, and that means they were subject to all kinds of different laws. The crew was a good, there wasn't any ambiguity about whether the crew worked. It's not like the DLC was shut down or, they were given a compensation for the owners. And there were enough people playing it that we were able to take consumer action on. But this is the initiative itself isn't focused on any one company.
No,
It's
but
just,
what I mean is that a lot like Ubisoft, they spend a ridiculous amount of money getting some exceptional artists around the world. They do
Yep.
make really beautiful worlds, and even if
They're
the game is
incredible.
pretty half baked, I played Star Wars Outlaws recently, but the world itself, there's a lot to speak about there. There's a lot to explore and a lot of smaller interactions with the NPCs. You're right. I mean, preserving that is something that is very important. I used to play a game called Meg on the PS3, which was a 128 versus 128 first-person shooter game on the PS3, and that's not available to me anymore. And that was just so ahead of its time that I'd love to jump back in and see what that experience was like when I was a kid, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
another
Well,
thing, go ahead.
no, go on, go on.
I was gonna say another thing, even if these games are still runnable, who knows? Maybe somebody else comes in after the fact and puts in bots to kind of halfway get to recreate that experience for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Although that would
Yeah,
require the
with
source code in that case, and most likely.
no, not necessarily. You just need to understand the protocol of the server, and you can reverse engineer that. And in fact, no one can stop you from doing that because it's protected work, right? You cannot stop someone from reverse engineering your server protocol. You are
Well,
always allowed to do that.
that brings me up to another point I wanted to mention earlier. When you were talking about like the giving their intellectual property away, they're not going to be losing rights to the intellectual property. So like it's like if you buy a book, you have the intellectual property in your hand, but you don't have any of the rights to that story or the world that the author created or anything. But you do have your individual copy that you can read for your own enjoyment. It'd be similar for this. So even if they were deciding to give out server binaries or even source code, they can still dictate the terms as to how it's used. All we're focused on is people who paid money into it can still run it.
No, I
And anything
agree.
beyond that,
Yeah.
they would have rights
I
for.
agree. My concern with that was that for games that need essentially to be played multiplayer to be considered playable, in my opinion, that because that IP law would still be there and the publisher developer could say, hey, we don't approve of this, they technically could shut down any community servers, in which case, is it playable? No, but they also don't have the right to make it playable because they can shut down servers.
Not if this initiative passed, they couldn't.
Exactly. Exactly. So what you're describing here would run afoul of Stop Killing Games.
Okay.
And then, yeah, that would be the solution. That's why it's pretty important to pass Stop Killing Games and not agree to, just be happy with what Ubisoft is doing with the Crew 2 and Motorfest. Like if we said, okay, Crew 2 and Motorfest are saved, let's pack it up, let's go home. The day after, Ubisoft can still take out the offline mode and screw everyone over. And besides, there's about 1 million games from today into the future that are not going to be protected, and we want all of them protected, not just 2.
The crew, it was never about just saving the crew. It was a vessel to get agencies to examine what the entire industry is doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I am happy they're doing offline modes, but it doesn't change any of our plans or actions.
Though the Crew is still an interesting example because it has licensed content within it, which is another big potential problem.
Actually,
I've worked on a game,
don't
for
think
instance, that used licensed content, and they do not allow you to give it out in that way.
Here's a question for you then. Are you aware of any game with licensed content that had to be delisted or stop selling it, where that also applied to the players? So in other words, you were not permitted to, under the EULA, to keep running that game. Because racing games, that happens all the time. Like Project Cars, some of the Forza games got delisted, but you can still all play those if you bought a copy of them.
You could keep running the game, but you would not be able to redistribute those files, right? It's similar to like a radio loss, right? You're allowed to play that radio on your radio station, but like somebody streaming a movie or video or something on Twitch, right? They don't have the broadcast rights. So it's kind of similar to that, where you don't have the right to redistribute it to people who, those source files to people who don't have access.
prior to the game shutting down. So they would have to plan for that. And okay, you have 3 months to download it or something. And then after that, they stop hosting it, but the people who have a copy can keep it.
Well, it's like you
So I
said, you
can
can
I
still
can give you
play
an
the.
example.
Yeah, keep going.
So the canonical example of this is radio stations in GTA, where over time, songs that have been licensed for, let's say, GTA Vice City, which are for some people like the most important part of the game itself. Like some of those radio stations are just absolutely genius. They're the
Yeah.
most redeeming quality of the game.
Very memorable.
The whole game is genius, but this is for many people the most important part. And GTA Vice City started changing its radio stations over time, or GTA 5 as well.
Mhm.
And they are still online, right? But for example, Vice City got delisted for the remastered or whatever that whole holy crap, that was so terrible. Like the way to disrespect a game like that. Holy crap. But anyways, Vice City got delisted. Let's say Vice City gets delisted and then the licenses for those radio tracks run out. They could still go to Steam and upload a new version of the binaries that doesn't have those songs in it anymore, even though the game has been delisted. So they could still do that.
Well,
The
songs are
only
sure a good
way
example, but think of like the Crew with pretty much all of its cars are licensed cars.
Yep. So I'm trying to get to that.
Okay.
So that's an example where things got delisted, or they had to be modified in order to stay compliant with the third-party license, right? But then there are a lot of people who are saying, oh, the Crew could never continue being in a usable state because of car licenses, this and that. And people were so extremely sure of this that it's because of car licenses, right? But we see now with the Crew 2, which has the same game engine, the same cars, licenses from the same companies, that they are going to be able to offer an offline mode that works in perpetuity, right? So then this means that you have to be very careful about, guessing what sort of license there might be between some company you don't work at and some other company you don't work at. You have no idea what their deal is. Maybe someone went to Ferrari, brought a bottle of wine, and they said, "Yeah, okay, use our cars." Maybe they did that, or maybe it's like an involved 10-year process to get the car in the game. Nobody knows. Nobody will ever know because those things are secret. We will never find out. There's no way to speculate about this. The only thing we can do is say, okay, you know what? Make your own deals. Just make sure that the consumers are being dealt with in a fair manner. And the way to be fair to consumers is to not take away things that they have bought, right? Simple as that. Like if you can't do your business in such a way that you can't ensure this, don't do that business.
Sure.
Yeah, so 2 quick points. Oh, do you want to?
Go. You go. You were ready.
Okay. The 2 quick points are, one, I'm still not aware of any game where the people who bought it cannot continue using the old licensed content. Like you can still run a copy of Vice City, the old one on PC or
On disk.
PlayStation 2 or something, and have the original tracks. That's legal. And the other thing is so we would need an example where this has actually happened, and I'm not aware of any. It could have, though. Like you said, we have no idea what's in these contracts. The other example is if Stop Killing Games, if the initiative passed, well, then this will be well known that, okay, we want to sell our big car game in the European Union, so we're going to need some license terms so that people who buy this can continue running it, assuming that's not already on the table already, which I think it is. So, I mean, I think the reason the Crew shut down was because it was made to be online only, and they had licenses that well, no, I'm not even sure the licenses entered into that, but the cost of them running the servers the best we know, the reason it shut down. So if this is a known requirement, companies can negotiate around that. And there are many, many games that's already happened with music and car licenses or other copyrighted content from a third party.
Well, let me rephrase a bit. Because the issue that I can see stems from, like, I worked on a game where we had licenses for trains in this case, and oh my god, I
Yeah.
could tell you stories about how annoying it was with that. But specifically about like licensed content
It's awesome
is usually that.
in your past videos.
Did I?
Yeah, about something about having trains crash.
Yeah, oh, yeah. I'll get to that in a second. Because that's a whole separate thing. But I don't think that would really have an issue with this law. But the issue that I can see is that usually when you get these licenses from companies, they're giving you, insert your company name here, the license to produce a game and to distribute it with that. What they're not giving you a license to do, or the licenses for other people, is to modify, redistribute, or host that content. So by releasing assets to a server, where, of course, being able to play a game's offline single player, like Spec Ops The Line recently went offline because it has licensed music that the licenses ran out. But if you own the game on Steam, you can still play it, right? But for games where, in order to be considered playable, because that could be different for each game, right? Context matters. And for those games where they would have to release some server binaries or server source code, something that runs separately to the client itself, that probably doesn't fall under license agreements, in which case this law would then either there would have to be additional law that targets those license agreements, or the entire industry would have to shift to that, and that probably brings about additional costs.
Yeah,
Well,
it could be pretty minor because again, if I'm not sure this is if it was already passed as an initiative, then it's a known requirement that the end user is going to have to allowed to run their individual copy. And I would think the contracts would reflect that. And again, I think many already have, because you can buy all these old games that have licensed cars that they're no longer selling. This sort
Do
of
they
thing, or
have
music.
dedicated servers that allow you to host
yeah,
that
I wanted
content,
to
though?
say something about this. I wanted to say something about
Okay.
this because you said that for example, when you're licensing a train from, I don't know, Deutsche Bahn,
Yeah.
then you need to license it, right, in order to sell a game with this in it, right?
Yeah.
But when I play your game, and let's say it's a multiplayer train game, right, MMO, or like a last man standing train collision game,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whatever. Let's think about what this actually entails. So I go on Steam, I download the game downloads all the files that it needs, including the models, the 3D models, and the textures, right? But when I want to run the dedicated server doesn't need those models and textures. So the dedicated server does not actually need to host those data files, right? My own personal copy of the client that actually displays the train needs to have those files, but I'm already allowed to do this
That
for
depends on
every
game.
game that I buy.
That depends on game.
What do you mean? Like
Some dedicated
if I
servers require you to download those resources because they might assume that you don't have the client installed to run it. Like I think even Terraria does that. You download the all the information and assets separately.
Okay, so what you're talking about is dynamic hosting of assets that the client can download while connecting to the server. This is something that I think was first popularized by Unreal Tournament, the first one, where servers could have like skin packs
Well, there's
and
that, but
voice
I'm talking
lines
about
installed on
dedicated
them, and then you
servers.
could yeah, exactly. Unreal Tournament dedicated servers could have like custom skin packs and voice lines and so on that you as the client would download so that people using those skins you would be able to see people using those skins, right? So that's like the first game I know of that had this sort of capability. There might have been one before that, but this is the first popular one that I know of. So yes, that's true. But I would say the simple workaround around this for the game company would be to just include all possible license data with the client that the client paid for, that the customer paid for. So then you don't have to download anything, and then you don't have to host anything, right?
There's another element that's more work, but it's another option if something was just untenable, is to come up with just slapdash substitutes for actually the original Counter-Strike mod had the official names of the guns and the manufacturers on it. And it's only later, once they became like a commercial game, that they put in substitute names and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So it could be like in the case of the Crew, it's like, all right, we're gonna go in and just kind of distort all the models like by 10% and give them made up names and then take care of it that way, or won't further
Sure.
our end of life build. I'm not proposing that's an ideal option. I really think the overwhelming solution would be, once this is a known requirement, the companies that are licensing this intellectual property find a way to do it so that the people who buy the game can continue playing the game, even if the parent company doesn't have permission to sell it anymore. And I think they would work out the details on it.
No, you're
This
right.
doesn't
Like,
strike me as
all these
insurmountable.
problems have solutions, but these solutions will increase cost. All of them.
Maybe in the short term and the long term, I'm not even sure they would.
I think long term they
Because
I
would.
don't know.
100%.
I think you're not correct, not fully right about this. Because, for example, I don't think anyone complains that GTA 5 isn't fun because they're not actually driving a Ferrari. Instead, they're driving like a Fiero. GTA, like the original top-down, like pseudo 3D game, is well known for the fact that they have all the real cars, but instead of a Porsche, you have like a Porca Turbo. And the sprites that they use for the cars are actually photos of real Hot Wheels versions of those
Sure, but
cars. So those
think
are
of Forza, think
real
of Gran
depictions of
Turismo,
history.
The Crew. These games often, their unique selling points are that you can drive real cars.
and you
And
can
in
still
yeah, sure.
and in order to
So-
modify that,
so
that does
different
cost
games.
money to make new models. And if you want to get licenses to allow people to host and modify or redistribute those files in some way by hosting dedicated servers, I 100% guarantee you that increases the cost of the license.
They don't
100%.
I
get to
agree.
they don't get to redistribute the karma. Like you said, that stuff's almost always client side, that they have the files. I don't think they even get to redistribute anything technically. What happens is, okay, you bought the game, and then once they shut it down and have the end of life plan, you as the customer can download the server file or the end of life patch or something, and then you can connect to other people who also bought that game and connect to it. I don't think it would be legal to just say, okay, yeah, here's the full version of the game, download it. Everybody can download it if you want, who wants to.
Well, the
Some
full version
companies
of the game
might
is
do that.
different than a dedicated server. The dedicated server doesn't run the client, but the dedicated server may require the source files in order to run the dedicated server. Like I gave Terraria as an example, because they're meant to be run without client involvement or download at all.
But then,
Okay,
how,
but Terraria is a game with a lot of user-generated and randomized content.
Not
Or
necessarily.
nearly the whole
No,
point.
no, no. You don't have to. You go onto Steam, you download the Terraria dedicated server, you run it. No problem. But the thing is, you have to download the source assets in some cases.
Yeah, sure, but anyone connecting to this already owns the game. Like,
yeah, okay,
sure,
okay,
you could
okay,
have pirates connecting to your game.
But that license,
That's
if
not what
it
we're
had
talking
licensed content, it would still require me to have a license with the licensor in this case. Like,
Well,
let's just say a car company.
the thing is, okay, first, that could probably be worked out in negotiations, because again, there's all kinds of car games you can continue
It
playing.
can, but it will increase cost.
Second, they don't have to distribute. Okay, so you're saying like just even Can you think of a game that had the license besides Terraria, like a game with copyrighted music or, car licenses or something like that, where the copyrighted portion was actually on the server and not the client files?
Of a game that I mean, you'd have to know what the individual licenses are, because it's possible that they got the license to allow for this in the first place.
So what is licensed in Terraria?
Terraria is just an example of a game where you have to download some resources in order to run the dedicated server.
Okay, but they don't have licensed content, right?
No, but I'm explaining that this is an example
Sure.
of this works. This happens in games, right?
I think going forward, if SKG passes, then developers will think about, okay, well, if we have to have licensed content, and we also have to have
Yes.
downloadable assets, then those assets that are licensed should be included with the client, and then that solves the problem, right? I think that's
But it will
simple as that.
increase cost. I'm not saying that
I
it
don't.
can't be
I don't
done.
think it
I'm
will.
saying that it will increase cost in a lot of cases
I'm saying
because
that's
I'm
what's
telling you,
done for almost
I've
all
worked with licensors directly. They're assholes. They want you
No,
to,
no, 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 no,
they
no.
want to charge as much money for you to do the least amount with their content in a lot of cases.
What
And
I'm
cars
what
are
I'm
much
saying is,
easier.
what I'm saying is that if a game has both content that is downloadable from the dedicated server and also licensed content, then as a developer, in order to not incur this additional licensing cost, you would include this licensed content, those licensed assets on the client side, because you would know that this is a thing that you can do going forward to
and
not incur this extra cost that you are worried about.
That solves that, but it doesn't solve the problem that licensors may restrict you for allowing other people to host servers with their content on it. That's
Right,
absolutely possible to include.
but then you make the server not actually include those assets, right?
And what I wanted to say is, I think that's how almost every game like this already functions.
Yes, exactly.
Where the car models and the textures or the music for these stations, they're all in the client right now. I mean, there might be a fringe example I don't know about, but so you say it's going to take extra cost. Well, it's what's already happening now, I think.
I'm just
And then
saying
we
that you
also have
may
to
not
think
have
about
the right to host that yourself within the license agreement. That when you get a license for a car or for a train or whatever, they're giving it to your company, not to the individual users. And the users get an end user license agreement with you, not the licensor.
But they're not they're not hosting the licensed content. They're hosting the server, which is devoid of that, and then the people who already bought it,
It
who have the
it
licensed
still
content,
accesses the licensed content though. It would still require additional clauses within the licensing agreements.
no,
that would be like every existing game that still runs.
no,
mean,
that's not what would be happening. So the dedicated server, like if you have licensed content about trains, cars, or whatever, the dedicated server would know, okay, car one is at location so and so, and it has physics like this, and it's going to move to that location within the next tick of the inner loop of the physics engine. But the dedicated server doesn't actually need to know, okay, this car has like the Ferrari prancing horse logo on the front, right? The server doesn't need to know that. So
it
the
just doesn't.
technological solution to the problem that you are depicting here is to have all of those assets with all of their licensed components be on the client, which they are already.
Yeah, but
So there's
let me
no
rephrase this
increase in
problem
cost
because
here.
maybe I'm just miswording it. Is that the dedicated server is still accessing licensed content when it's
Why?
interacting with the player? Or the client
Why
is,
that?
yes, the client
Why does
has,
the
well, let me say this. The client has the licensed content, correct?
Yeah, sure,
Yes. The dedicated server is interacting with the clients.
sure.
It may fall into licensing agreements that the dedicated server does not have authority, that people hosting this cannot either monetize it or host it. Monetize, certainly not, if it's accessing licensed content.
No, because you went from the server is talking to the client, you went from this, you went to the server is accessing this data on the client. And I don't see the connection between those two steps.
Those
I think
sound like the same thing to
that
me.
doesn't connect. They're not to me. To me, the
No, because
server
like
talks to the client and finds out about the positions of the separate actors within the game engine and what their projectiles are and what their interactions are with other actors and what their actions are when where they are moving. But it doesn't actually access the dedicated server does not actually access the licensed assets that are on the
Yeah,
client.
that's
the
not what
way
I'm
I look
implying
at
is
it, like,
happening.
yeah, okay, it's like the server looks at the client, you're online, and it says, okay, this is car number 537. And then on the client side, car 537 is a Porsche 911. But the server doesn't know that. Okay, this other car is car 438, and car 438 went to this position, car 537 went to this position. I don't see why the server would need to know any more than that. How the brands or anything would. Am I making sense or?
I think we
Me.
mean separate things.
Okay.
I think this is just a miscommunication, I think.
So I think what you're trying to say is that a licensing agreement might be written in a very intrusive way into the business of the game developer,
Yeah.
whereas the licensing agreement says that if you have a binary that uses our Porsche or Ferrari assets, then in that case, this executable may not connect to anything else unless that something else is also hosted by you, the developer, directly. That's a very specific clause, and I would question the ability for anyone to get this past legal review of a large company. And here we have to really think about what we are talking about with regards to increased cost, because increased cost is not a big deal for someone like Microsoft or Sony. Increased cost is a big deal for like a AA or like an
Yeah.
indie developer, right?
That
But
kind of
they are
leads us
not
into
going to be
another thing.
licensing from Ferrari, right?
Well, actually, licensing cars is a lot easier than licensing things that aren't cars. I'll put it that way.
Oh yeah, sure.
Because
But
there's
what I'm
tons of
trying to
car
say,
games, and those car companies are usually very used to those sorts of things. They've been used to it for decades, right? Because they've been making games with licensed cars forever. But for things that isn't common, like I mentioned for trains, it was way harder to get licenses, and the licenses were extremely strict. We had an open world train game, and Deutsche Bahn wouldn't let us drive their trains outside of Germany. Well, it's an open world. How am I supposed to stop the player from doing that? And
Okay, well, that's a great example because if the licenses are going to be that restrictive, we're already talking about an existing minefield
yes,
of like hundreds
Yeah.
that you could run into. So we're talking about literally one more mine, maybe, to save all games, essentially.
Yes.
So I think the trade-off would be, and if that's just not possible, worst case scenario, we do have to fall back on similar models, that kind of capture the spirit of whatever brand it is you're trying to get, but you just, for the smaller companies that can't jump through these hoops,
I think
they
it's
would have to adapt.
possible, but licensors have a good stranglehold over developers in a lot of cases, where if you have pitched this game with the idea that you will have licenses, which you often have to do before you even get funding, you're often just, well, whatever we have to pay to get the licenses is going to be what it is because the players expect this. And if they don't have that, there's not a lot we can say. So if we add in additional requirements to this, that now the player gets to do X or Y with it after release of the game, that can add cost. They might just ask for more money.
But you're talking about, okay, well, I was gonna say, it just seems like if they won't let you drive it outside of Germany, it sounds like it's already so restrictive already that we're just like begging for crumbs at this point. Like, and for stuff that we're blind to for these negotiations. Like you said, we don't know what the contracts are, so. Okay,
We
You
don't.
just never know what it's going to look like until you actually go to their company and ask them. and
So
that's
what
just
I
a
can tell you
crapshoot.
is I've negotiated a good 200 different licensing contracts in my time.
For what kind of content,
And
out of curiosity?
it's not like licensed, brand content or stuff like that. It's about developer IP, code IP, technology
Okay.
licensing and stuff like that. Right? But what I can tell you about negotiations in general is a few things. First of all, people who want to negotiate usually want to make a deal happen. They don't even go into negotiations if they just want you to go away.
Yeah.
So, given the outset that they actually want to make something happen, they want to get something out of the negotiation, people are usually reasonable with their expectations, and it's not extremely difficult to make them understand that something they are asking for is completely unreasonable and completely impossible
I
to
don't know.
meet. So at this point, if you're dealing with a company and you tell them, listen, if we can't do this, then we cannot license your content at all because the business case simply is not there. At this point, the other side goes and sits down and thinks, okay, well, you know what? They're probably right. And we need to reevaluate things and either make the deal with less restrictive stipulations or we just break off the deal completely. And it's usually not a thing of, oh yeah, but by the way, you require this to be used in Europe or you require this to be used on Earth, therefore we want $100 more, right? It's not like that. People don't set up negotiations with like really extremely stupid gotchas like that because at this point
Branded
they
content
risk
is different,
losing
and
this stuff.
it's really a matter of public perception. So, for instance, you mentioned
Yep.
earlier at the start of the topic, we weren't allowed to. I think it was same with Deutsche Bahn. They wouldn't allow us to derail their trains, and this was not a graphical or
No.
violent representation. It was actually just a fade to black screen that said "you derailed." Right? It was very,
Yep.
and it's because the player drove too fast. I mean, that's going to happen in a game where you get to drive trains, and they wouldn't allow this, and so
Yep.
that again, that messes with the entire structure of the game, and we didn't know this until we did those negotiations. So now that adds development time that we need to find a different solution to this, or we need to limit the usage of this branded content somewhere. I'm not saying that
Exactly.
it might add $1, it might add 100,000. We just don't know until you get those contracts on the table.
Exactly. But if you confront the company with the fact that currently the legal framework of actually selling games is such that you must have this provision met, then there's simply nothing they can negotiate about because it's an
Sure, it's
impossibility,
speculative that
right?
it's going to increase development.
Two quick things. One, if they're going to be that particular about their license, like let's say Ferrari, okay, but you can't have custom rims, and custom rims
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a big part of the game or something. But you have to charge more if you have custom rims. If they're going to charge you for every little thing, then the introduction of just the player being able to run the game, that's just going to be an excuse. They'll if they don't do it there, they'll do it for the windshield wipers and somewhere else. They're probably aiming for whatever target they can hit, and it's just another excuse to try to jack up the price. And if they don't get it there, they'll get it somewhere else. And the other is, if this became an initiative, that would be well known across the industry. So like with GDPR requirements or something, like a lot of companies know they need to do that now, and that affects how they conduct their business. So like let's say they're in negotiations and they're saying, no, we don't want to do this. But then they negotiate with another company. They're saying, no, we have to adhere to these E regulations. And the third one says, we have to adhere to these E regulations. At some point, they're going to get the hint that they either need to bend to this or else they're just going to pull out from the games industry if they feel like it's that big a deal, which I don't think they would, because ultimately they stand to gain money from this.
That's
So-
true, and especially true with cars, because you put a car in a game, you put a Ferrari. That's just more people that drive the Ferrari realize it's a cool car and want to then purchase it in the future, right?
Or music, that's
Yeah, music too.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, companies not only don't hate money, but many of them are forced to accept any sort of income that they can possibly eke out of their brands and of their intellectual property. Because otherwise, if they do not, then they can get sued by their shareholders
Though I
for
can
not increasing
understand the
fair
issue
value.
with brand perception, and
Yeah,
I
of
really,
course, right?
yeah. Although you'd think they would separate the difference between a user error and how their brand was perceived, but apparently not.
Yeah. I mean, I can fully understand trains company not wanting someone to even like conceptually crash
Yeah.
a train, because then this could lead to like a 15-second clip of a train going too fast and then it fading to black, and the screen saying you crashed, and then that 15-second clip goes around and goes, oh, this is what's going to happen if you go on like Hungarian rail lines or
And then some
whatever,
grandma
and then
watches it and
you
thinks
don't
it's a
want
real
that.
news report. Oh my
Or
god.
yeah, or it could be, yeah, right. So I mean, that's honestly that's fully warranted, I would say. But being able to continue playing your game shouldn't be a thing that negatively affects someone's brand, right? In
No.
fact, if a company is found out to argue against gamers being able to continue playing their game, then that would negatively affect their brand.
I can be devil's advocate and think of a couple scenarios where that might not be true, but they're kind of fringe and why fuel the fire? So
Okay. Yeah, I want to talk about the just kind of the cost of this, right? Where like you said, there's going to be some compromise. We've already identified some places where either having lawyers on retainer or smaller developers, because this really is a case of the larger companies that probably already have some of these stopgaps in place or have the bandwidth, either from a financial level or a personnel level, can easily implement this or adapt to this. But smaller companies where they're working on a shoestring budget, this is going to increase the cost at a higher percentage than it is for the larger companies that have larger budgets.
okay, so so you're worrying about like the middle developers that are relying on this?
Essentially, the cost is probably more flat than it is scaled for games. I'm thinking that a smaller developer that's making a game that would fall under SKG and would need to have this end of life, the costs to do that are probably pretty similar to a larger game, but that the budget of these larger companies makes it a much
I mean,
smaller
they can
percentage of the
absorb
total cost.
there. I guess 2 points to that. One, your average small developer is probably not making an online only game, but the ones that are, I think this is the sort of thing where it could be a little bumpy initially, but over time, I think it would become almost negligible, because my theory is if this passed, there would be a gold rush of middleware to say like, hey, if you buy our solution for your online only game, then we make it easy to compile an end of life build that's fully compliant with the EU requirements. So you can have private hosting, but until that day, you can, offload it to whatever server you want in the meantime. So I think it would just become one. I think it could kind of end up being merged with just the requirement of making an online game in the first place over time. And maybe Damian even knows some solutions now, or maybe it just gets too specific to really weigh in on that. But I think this is a problem that would solve itself. However, it could be some disruption in the short term. I think Damian may have cut out, so maybe we'll ask
Oh,
him.
did he?
Oh, is he back here?
I am here. I was sorry. I was refilling my water.
No worries, no worries.
Okay. What I was
So,
gonna say. Okay, did you catch it or?
well, I heard you talking about like the gold rush of technology,
Yeah, yeah,
and I knew where that was going.
sure.
Yeah. So, with regards to like really small developers, if you have like a team of 10 people, maybe even 50 people, you're gonna have like 1 or 2 really good developers there, right? And they're gonna be the ones setting up the server, developing it, setting up the infrastructure, stuff like that. Those are usually like really highly skilled people.
Yeah.
And I 100% assure you that they just have the server while they're developing. They have the server running on their laptop within Docker, or worst case scenario within a VM. And the whole cost of being compliant with SKG is for them to take that VM image or that Docker image and just dump it on mega.conz, and that's it. That's it. That's the whole cost at that point, because those companies, why there'll be companies that run very lean, and they have to think about what they are doing and so on. They already run in ways, and they develop their software in ways where doing SKG is just so trivial. Like
That
I
depends on
can't
the
imagine
scale,
someone.
but yeah.
I can't imagine like a 10-person company with like a single developer who is unable to run his own server on his own computer. And this is usually something where he has a build going and just runs the build. And you know what? Just copy that build out to an FTP server somewhere, and that's it.
Well, it's usually that, a 10-person company is hopefully making a game that is within scope of their team and their budget size. Um, obviously, that isn't always the case. I mean, with game dev, all the release games, that's only maybe a small 5 to 10% fraction of games that are actually ever developed. Most of them fail at those early stages. And for sure, with something like a networked game, right? That's something that you design from pre-production. I mean, you don't. If your game is going to be released, with a dedicated server, that's not something that you decide at the end of production. That's something that you decide within pre-production, because you have to build the games. You have to build the architecture from the ground up with that.
Yep.
But that kind of brings me
This
to
is
a
like
point that we skipped. Unless you can keep going.
no, go on.
So this kind of deals with like bankruptcy and loss of knowledge. What happens theoretically in the case of a company going under before they ever planned on end of life. I mean, unfortunately to Annapurna, they just announced that their whole staff had quit recently, and they have some games that are online like that, or a loss of knowledge. So maybe somebody quits or is fired, and that person who was in charge of the infrastructure and would have been in charge of releasing those binaries or preparing them isn't around to do that.
Well, this is another one that's totally in the EU's camp for how that gets decided. I'm seeing two basic options here, but maybe there's some more. One is, I think any penalties to not adhering to this would be financial. So if the company's bankrupt, well, then yeah, we probably do lose that game. But most companies are motivated to not go bankrupt. That's a pretty strong incentive without having to have the games tied to it. The other option would be, okay, if they go bankrupt, then some other bigger company decides, well, hey, maybe we're going to buy this intellectual property from them. Maybe that includes responsibility for making good on that end of life build, or maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure for that, but I think that would reduce the number. Yeah, I think I said in one of my videos, if every time a game died, that meant the publisher went bankrupt over that, I would never have started this initiative, because that would highly motivate, publishers to have end of life plans, or the ones
Yeah.
that would go down with the ship would be quite rare, I
I
think.
can see publishers not wanting to inherit spaghetti code though from a developer, and that's just
Yeah,
going to
like
be
didn't
a lot of money.
Redfall do that on their way out? Like they added an offline mode for Arcane
So,
Studios.
It sounds familiar.
I can give you a perspective of how those things could work. So both bankruptcy and loss of knowledge, because I think those are things that have already existed for a very long time, even before computers.
Yeah.
So we have to differentiate between loss of knowledge and bankruptcy, because those are like very different scenarios.
100%.
So let's first talk about loss of knowledge, okay? So loss of knowledge, and this is something that I'm actually pretty acutely aware of, because that's how most modern dev companies are run, which is you think about something called the bus factor, which is how many developers need to be hit by a bus before you can continue business, right? And that's actually a thing. You can go look it up, bus factor. And every modern technology company is run in such a way that everyone is immediately replaceable, right?
Ideally,
So
I don't know, most game companies, it's
ideally,
not that
yeah.
way at all.
And that's a thing that I was going to comment on, which is that a lot of game companies are unfortunately still a couple decades behind in their approach to technology. And I gotta say, that's on them. That's on the games industry.
I agree.
Because all of the modern approaches, both technological, managerial, operational, they are all available for free. You can learn them for free. You can find a million people who know them. You can go on IRC and just, troll people until they spoon feed you this knowledge. There's no way not to learn it if you want to. But,
I agree. I wish you could
going
get that through to the management and a lot of companies and the production teams because
well,
it's not it
well,
doesn't work that way,
that's
unfortunately.
I know it doesn't, but in the end, that's on the games industry.
Yeah.
So that's loss of knowledge, right? Let me say something more about loss of
Okay.
knowledge. So the typical thing that you would do to prevent loss of knowledge is, first of all, you secure the laptop. After the developer quits, you take his laptop and you store it somewhere, and you make sure that all the files are still there. They don't run off with the laptop or whatever. And if you need to hire someone new, at least you will have the state of the project as they were working on it, right? So you have all the files, all the source code, maybe some of the builds, maybe some of them run, maybe you have some of the debugger, maybe you have some of the like Terraform files or Docker files, VMs, whatever, right? You pretty much have everything that the old developer had. You might have a lot of his logins as well to cloud services and so on, right? So that's your responsibility as a developer to prevent loss of knowledge as a game development company, right? As a manager within the game development company. Now, that said, you hire someone new, it takes them ages to get into the thing, but if you find someone who is skilled enough and you have actual legal obligations to do things, then you are forced to find someone who you'll pay good money for, but they will be skilled enough to be able to continue the project by learning on their own without the help of the past developer. I mean, I've personally worked on projects where if you looked at it was SVN history at that point. SVN is a precursor to Git, which
I've
is
used
being
SVN,
used
yeah.
nowadays. So I looked into the SVN history and I looked at the names of the people who were committing code into it. And there were groups of people where one group of people got all of them left or they all got fired. And then there was a new group of people, they all left, and then a new group of people. And there were like 6 generations of disjoint developers who never overlapped on the project, right? I mean, this is something that happens in technology all the time. So not being prepared for this, that's not really an excuse. You're just
No,
running a
but
shitty shop,
no, I agree. But that requires really good
right?
architecture, and that isn't super
I,
common to come by.
This made me, this reminded me,
architecture?
I
Like
think there was
architecture,
a
code
line,
architecture.
sorry.
No, I don't think so. I think so. The code that I am talking about, right? This example with 6 different generations of developers, that was the single worst code base that I have ever seen, and it had like real
Oh, you were implying that it was
life.
bad. Yeah, I mean that sounds right.
It was no, it was a terrible code base, and yet the project was able to continue with 6 generational cutoff changes of developers. So even the code was absolutely terrible, even though it was absolutely dangerous that it was terrible, like real life dangerous. It would have if something went wrong, it would you would have to evacuate a whole town, whole city, right? It was still code in a project that was able to continue with complete loss of knowledge
This is pretty niche,
6
though. I
times
mean,
over.
there's
Well, I'm
perfect
giving you a
examples of games
Well,
like
I'll
RuneScape,
give you
for instance, which
examples.
had spaghetti code so bad that it took the developers years to unspaghettify it and actually make a newer client.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I can't say much about this, but there are good approaches to working with legacy code. I mean, there's a book called Working with Legacy Code.
Either way,
It's
I
by one of
agree
the big four,
that it's the
right?
developer's responsibility. I agree with that 100%.
yeah,
Okay, so then there's bankruptcy. But before we go to bankruptcy, Ross wanted to
Yeah.
say something.
no, I was remembering on the other end of the spectrum. I think there was an incident from Elias Tech Tips video where he was at an auction for, I think it was NCIX, and he just found like this printed out stack of like all customer logs and info on it. It's like, wait a minute, they can't just do that, can they?
Oh my
And
god.
I was thinking that's really what happens on the other end of the spectrum where it just shuts down. Nobody knows what happened to anything.
It's like kind of like
And
Enron too and
Yeah.
stuff, yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
so it's that's an assumed risk. But okay, going on bankruptcy, I guess.
Okay, so then there's bankruptcy, right? And we have to think about bankruptcy in terms of what is the actual stipulation that needs to be complied with here. So the stipulation is you pay $70 for a game. It's not 60 anymore. It's 70 now, right? And you pay the $70 for a game, and then by law, you are given, when the game shuts down years later, you are given a new piece of executable. Either a patched version of the game or a dedicated server or something like that, right? So this is, in essence, a pre-order on a piece of technology that will have to be delivered to you. We don't know exactly when, but we know that it must be delivered to you. So this is a pre-order. So legally, this works exactly the same way as any other pre-order ever. Before computers, before technology, you were able to pre-order a castle. You paid for a castle, and then either it got built in 50 years or it didn't, right? Well, how was it handled, right? I mean, it went to court or it went in front of the king, and they decided it. But less abstractly and more modernly, if you pre-order, say, a car, and then the factory shuts down, well, what happens? Well, there's a process, right? The factory itself or the company owning the factory has creditors. People who pre-ordered cars and are waiting for shipment, they are creditors of the company. But also people who invested in the company are creditors of the company, and so on and so forth. And company assets are going to be managed in such a way that the highest number of the highest level creditors are going to be satisfied. And when a company has creditors, not all creditors are the same. So different kinds of creditors exist. There's going to be like A-level creditors, B-level creditors, C-level creditors. And I believe that's also where the whole term AAA games comes from. It comes from the credit industry, like AAA level credit, like you have AAA level credit, right? So this means that if you invest in us to make this AAA game, then you are 100% sure to get your money back.
This is only one side of who's, let's just
Yeah,
say,
sure.
financially responsible, right? There are private companies, single member LLCs, like my company is single member LLC.
Yeah, but if you're selling stuff with the promise of delivering something later on, then the person who bought it suddenly becomes your creditor in some way, right? So what happens even before computers? What happened to car companies that weren't able to deliver the cars? And the the production line stood to a stop, and the cars are like half assembled. What happens then? Well, I think those are things that are legally probably already worked out. So if we want to know what happens there, we have to look at what happened in those situations, because this being a creditor to a company is not limited to games, right?
Hey, oh, good. I want to say we've been going 2.5 hours. I mean, I was thinking I can answer some more if you want, but maybe we should, depending on what you want to do. If you have a lot of questions, maybe we could either rapid fire, or if you have like one or two more that you want to get into deeper depth on, maybe we can.
I only really have one more smaller thing that
Okay,
probably won't take
great.
more than 15 minutes. And then I don't know how much time you
Oh,
have, but if anybody has any specific questions in chat, just at me in chat with your question, and uh, we'll see how much time that Ross and Damian have.
yeah, we can try and answer some more. I didn't mean to cut you off too much. If you had to finish something else, and
Well, I wanted to say another thing, which is when a company goes bankrupt, they're usually assigned a bankruptcy officer by the government. And the bankruptcy officer makes sure that, you know, right is done by the creditors. And it can very well be that the bankruptcy officer goes and says, okay, well, you guys should have released those binaries, and I can hire an IT guy to find those binaries somewhere within your, developer workstations and just release those binaries. And it'll cost like maybe $20,000, but the guy will find them, and 100,000 people will be complete within the rights,
If it's
right?
playable,
And
if the
if
developers
it's playable,
actually did their due
yeah,
diligence, right?
exactly, right. But if there's a game that already had working online servers, it's highly likely that
Yeah.
they are able to release them in
I
some way.
suppose the more
So at this point,
interesting
the bankruptcy
question,
officer would be dealing with that.
I suppose the more interesting question then is, if the company goes bankrupt, what if another company buys that IP? Do they assume the responsibility to finish it? Is that assumed when they purchase that out, right? Like, what's a recent example?
I think that's going to be an
Well, I mean,
EU question. But
well, that's again with
Yeah.
regards to
What would you like to see, I
bankruptcy
guess?
proceedings, what the deal is between the buying company and the bankruptcy officer, and so on, and the creditors. Because when a bankrupt company is being bought out by another company, then that's an agreement between, at that point, I think, the company's creditors and the company buying the old assets. So the creditors have to like come to some sort of agreement with the new company, and part of that agreement might be that they release end of life, uh, server binaries or whatever.
Yeah, like what would we like to
Right.
see happen if this passes?
Well, ideally, that's exactly what happens when a company goes bankrupt. Then bankruptcy officers or relevant officers in the government know that such a company might have this specific liability because of stop going games, and that this liability needs to be fulfilled, and that it's usually probably not very expensive to fulfill it, therefore they should do it. That's what we probably would like to see.
to me, the cases where the game dies because the company goes bankrupt is rare enough that I'm not terribly worried about it if we get everything else. So even if it just goes down with the ship, companies have plenty of incentive to not go bankrupt already without us having to pile on to
I
this.
hope it remains a rarity. Not if Embracer Group gets their choice about it. Last thing was just that this initiative might not pass, right? And what are some compromises that maybe we could, as a collective, because you've gotten over, last time I checked, it was over 350,000 votes. It's probably way more now.
Maybe not way more, but
Hey,
it's trickling along. It's kind of following an exponential curve.
how many months do you
so
have left to this?
like 10, something like that.
So still, because
Yeah,
it was a
still a
1
lot.
year, right? So it's still a considerable amount of time left.
I mean, it's still not a sure thing, right? It's within reach,
Sure.
but people actually need to get out and sign.
Unfortunately, we shouldn't be talking to you. We need to be talking to people who don't speak English. Is what we need.
Yeah, actually, you're 100% right about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Especially Americans that move to Poland, like, I can't even sign this initiative. So,
Me neither.
is there any
Yeah.
possibility of a compromise here?
Well, yeah. Well, there's two aspects to that. If we get the signature threshold, yeah, like I personally would still be pretty. Let's say we don't get what we're asking for, but we do get like the equivalent of right to repair requirements when they shut it down. So they have to release some code or some documentation that gives knowledgeable customers a chance to restore it. I would still consider that a huge win. Or with the compromises, again, I don't think we're gonna get subscription games on this, but I'd like it if we did, but I'm not seeing the legal angle for that, really. Um, but that's if we pass. If we do not pass the signature threshold, it doesn't matter about compromises because we're not getting anything. So this just gets nothing happens. So that's the. However, that said, we already have the consumer protection action going on independent of this. We have no say in the outcome of that, but that may have some real teeth. So I kind of pursued this from every angle I could. I guess I would consider this a very distant compromise, which would be let's say we did get an expiration date, like either on the box or on the store page digitally. I think that would help. I don't think it would solve it, but it might shift a lot of. I think there's a lot of potential that just having that information on your page and planting that idea that this game's going to die and we know exactly when would result in more lost sales than the cost it would take to have an end of life plan from the beginning. So I think that might be a back way towards it, but that's way more precarious.
I had a potential compromise that I talked about in my videos where developers and publishers have a mandatory minimum time to announce their server shutdown, and anyone who purchased the game X amount of months before that announcement is entitled to a no questions asked full refund. Just as a potential solution where you at least know when that end of date is coming, and if you purchased it near to that announcement, no questions, no matter how much time you put into it or what you achieved, you can get a refund if you want.
Yeah, I think in Germany, what was it? WBS Legal, they're a big German legal YouTube channel. They were saying something similar that by announcing this 3 months in advance, they were probably in violation. It needed to be more like 2 years.
2 years, wow.
To me, that's just I don't know. I'm very cynical on this, and I don't think that would change much at all. I guess a few companies that don't have their ducks in a row would, you know, might have to give out more refunds, but I don't think it would result in much more beyond that.
Well, I can make some commentary on this because
Yeah, go ahead.
specifically in Germany, I don't know how it is in other places, but I know the law in Germany. When you buy something, you are normally, as a consumer, entitled to having it for 2 years. That's the expected default lifetime of a thing you buy. So, for example, I bought something online a while back and I wanted to return it because I didn't like it, right? But I wanted to return it after 2 months. So the seller was entitled to and told me that they would only pay back like the proportional amount of 2 years minus 2 months. So, and they were entitled to that because that's the way the law is structured. The law is structured in such a way that you buy something, you have it for 2 years. Anything after that is a bonus, but you have it for at least 2 years. So that's why they probably said that, you know, they should have announced that 2 years in advance so that everyone had the ability to exploit the fruit of their purchase for at least 2 years, right?
It's really difficult in the game industry to prepare for. I mean, we're talking about
Yeah,
millions of
I mean,
dollars minimum that a company is going to be spending to keep the lights on for
I
2
know,
years.
but that's the way the law already
Yeah,
exists,
well,
right? Like from times before computers already.
um, yeah, I suppose, compromise. I don't want to talk about compromises now because that assumes the worst, and I'd like to see this initiative pass as
No,
many
no
potential
compromise.
issues.
Compromises are not the worst. Compromises means we pass the threshold and we're in negotiations.
That's true.
And again, if we get just a decent chance to repair games so that they, remove DRM and give us some documentation to make server emulators or something, that could still do a lot. So, no, worst case
Yeah,
scenario is all the consumer protection action fails and we don't pass the signature threshold. And this was all a waste, except we did get the Crew 2 and Motorfest, I guess. So as a consolation prize. That
Yeah.
would be the worst case scenario.
yeah, but I mean, we can still talk about like the future of Stop Killing Games, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. We don't have to only talk about like the worst case
Yeah.
scenario. But even in the worst case scenario, what we have done is we have shown, let's say, 1,200,000, or maybe just 500,000 if we didn't reach the threshold. We have shown very many people that they can band together in order to defend their interests. And I think this is a really important thing to see, because a lot of people nowadays are completely disenfranchised. They think that they cannot do anything about the reality that surrounds them.
Yes.
And many of them see it as like, one of those Star Trek episodes where you're in the wrong timeline. Like there was on The Next Generation, I think in season 2, there was an episode where the lights were off everywhere and everyone wore like those high vis belts across their chests. I call that the fashion crime universe. And that one had Tasha Yar, by the way. Anyways, what Stop Killing Games is showing people already is that they can change things. They can get back to where they should be. Even if Stop Killing Games currently, if our ECI fails, nothing's stopping us from regrouping and trying again with something better, something stronger, and something even more resilient. But if it does pass, then this can be the first step of many towards clawing back what gamers and consumers in general deserve to have in their lives. Because there's a lot of problems in games. There's problems with regards to predatory monetization.
Oh yeah.
There's problems with regards to games being sold in one way, and then a year later it's like a completely different game that you didn't buy. There's problems with regards to all sorts of stuff. Epic Games bans you from your account, and suddenly you lost like $100,000 in microtransactions or whatever.
Well, there
right?
isn't a lack of players speaking up against this. In my opinion, there's a lack of developers speaking up against these things out of any
What I
number of
think
problems.
is that a lot of people are speaking up against this, but they don't know how to make their voice matter. And the way they make their voice
True.
matter is by doing ECIs, organizing the way we
Yeah,
did with
organizing.
Stop Killing Games. By doing an ECI, a lot of people are like, oh, you go to the EU, why would you do that? Well, we're doing that to min-max our chances of winning this, right? Like, if you're playing World of Warcraft, you're going to min-max your healer, right? To make sure that you win the most dungeons. Why wouldn't we be doing that with Stop Killing Games? I mean, this makes no sense as a gamer, right? You want to have the best possible outcomes, and the best possible outcomes that we're going to get is by harnessing the ECI to do this. And even if the ECI doesn't succeed, we still have amassed so many people that we can definitely make some change happen for the gamers, right?
This goes back to what you mentioned earlier about us not being a hive mind. Damian's far more optimistic on this than I am. I do not think the ECI is our only chance. I think we have three, maybe 3.5 chances beyond that with France, Germany, and Australia with the consumer protection action. Any one of those could shift the wave on this. I really think there's a chance there. But let's say all that fails and this fails. Damian sees us being able to regroup and try again, not me. Don't get me wrong. I admire his optimism, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it. So I think I'm treating all this like this is my only shot. If this all burns and goes down, I don't think we make any progress. I think there's too much, like I think it comes back to organization again. I
I
think there's
think you're
just too
right.
much disorganization about everything.
I review
That
Kickstarter, like game Kickstarters, every month, and God, that is a test of mental stability for sure. But there's a lot of companies that try to put their games up on Kickstarter every time it fails, and it's just like, nah. They garner less and less interest each time because after your first attempt, you don't convert as many people over. People didn't see your game as being possible to complete in the first place, so they don't want to give you money the second time because it wasn't possible the first time. So yeah, I kind of agree with you that I think this is your one and only chance to do it and to make a statement.
Yeah, this is exactly why it's so important that Stop Killing Games succeeds. Because if it does, then we can just keep on rolling, keep on fixing things. You hate microtransactions, vote on SKG. You hate weird stuff in your games, go sign SKG.
NFTs,
You hate
blockchain, loot
you
boxes.
hate blockchain in your games, go sign SKG. You hate NFTs, you hate games costing more and more, go sign SKG, because this is how we get started. Stop Killing Games, being able to retain the ownership of your games is the first step of many in clawing back all of this corporate greed that was started by Android Wilson, that was started by Yves Guillemot, that was started by Bobby Kotick, and all of those fat cats that have those 100-foot yachts that don't play games, don't care about gamers. They just profit off of, sucking our blood
Hey,
out
let
of our
Bobby have
veins,
his breast
right?
milk, okay? Come on.
Bobby
He's a
having his
thirsty
breast milk,
man.
he could lose some weight, let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really topical, right? I mean, those like massive game developers have had it very good for very long. No one fought against anything they did, and they just didn't respect what they had.
I mean, it's
And
business, right?
now
Like
that's what happens.
you try to optimize the business. You hire the people that are best at that. The unfortunate part is, for the most part, the people best at that have nothing to do with game dev or care anything about gamers. So you have shoestring budgets where developers feel like they have to suckle the teat of the publishers and investors because that is the only way they'll keep the lights on. And sadly, that's true. And you just end up with this loop that seems almost
well,
impossible to break.
we don't feel that way, so we're willing to go in
Oh,
and
I think it can be
Exactly.
broken
disrupt
too.
it
Yeah,
if possible. So
Yeah.
I'm all for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I mean, if the game companies, if the massive game companies don't want to respect their customers, they will be forced to respect them by law, and that's what happens when you don't respect people, right? You don't respect people, they fight back. They fight back for the respect that they are not being given. And this is what's happening. This is what Stop Killing Games is about on like a
or
philosophical level.
or we're ushering in a dystopia, but the thing that drives me crazy is I want to know that's the outcome. I don't want this. See, that's what's driven me crazy about it, is that I saw these openings. I was thinking, well, I think the only reason maybe this is going on is because nobody is doing anything about it, and I actually can influence this. Now, if I thought this was impossible, I never would have started this campaign. Like if I know, no, we're doomed. It's all locked down. There's nothing we can do. Okay, well then I just have to deal with it. But it's like knowing that, oh, this could all change if we do something. That's just drove me nuts, and the reason I spent so much time on
Yes,
this.
see, this is a thing that a lot of people just don't realize about Ross, which is, a while back, long after I joined Stop Killing Games, right? I just stumble upon like a video, and I'm like, oh, cool, a new Stop Killing Games video. I'm watching it, right? I watch it, like all the wording is exactly the same as the newest Stop Killing Games video, right? All the same topics, all the same covers. And then I look at the date of upload, and it's like 9 years ago. And I go to Ross and I go, holy crap, dude, I had no idea that you've been thinking about this for 9 years. And he's like, no, I've been thinking about this for 25 years. Right?
Yeah.
And I had no idea. Most people don't know about this, that he's been working on this. He's been thinking about this and like juggling like every single possible scenario in his head for 25 fucking years.
I
This
haven't been
guy,
working on it that long.
yeah,
I
probably
kept
not
hoping
working on it,
somebody.
but
I
it's
kept
it's
hoping
always in the
this
back
would
of your
fix.
head, right?
Yeah.
Always in the back of your mind. And a lot of people don't realize just how much thought went into this. So you have like those reaction videos where a guy opens the Stop Killing Games website and reads like one sentence, and while he's reading it, he immediately goes, "No, that's stupid." Right? He didn't even think about it for like 5 seconds, and he goes, "No, that's stupid." And he doesn't realize that 25 years of thought went into this.
That's
It's
always
Right?
gonna exist. It's
there's
just a shame to
different
see it.
there's different values too, because I think most of the people who kind of take that approach, they're looking at this from a developer standpoint. Like, okay, let's say we have a game that was never designed for this, and they're asking to change this to have an end of life plan and make it work under all these license agreements. So they're seeing this as just as here and now, present day impossible. And I don't have time to necessarily explain the full process that no, this is more future looking, and for existing games, well, maybe this will happen, maybe this will happen, that sort of thing. So I get where some of them are coming from. So, or some people just don't realize it is possible until after it happens, you know?
I don't think it's possible to talk about Stop Killing Games without getting nuanced. And if you're not willing to, you know, like Josh Trey Hayes, if you know him, he says a lot about like how players need to meet developers halfway, right? You're not going to enjoy a game if you don't meet the developer halfway and try to engage in it in the way that it was designed. And I think that this initiative is similar, where if you don't try to jump in and engage with it and at least burst through the high level, the surface level a little bit, then it's easy for you to write it off and not really contribute anything. And you need to go
Well,
deeper.
that's why we're here. You're a developer.
I'm not the
Yeah.
one. I'm just such a tiny little indie dev. I've only worked in indie and double A. You should be talking to people who are in triple A.
Well, it's yes and no, because I'm looking at this almost like it's a military operation where I'm just looking backwards from, okay, the goal is save games. How do we get there? We've done the consumer action for the most part. The European Citizens Initiative is the main thing left. And none of that happens unless we pass that signature threshold. So, I mean, yeah, I'll respond to developers who want to talk about this, but if I'm reaching out to developers, I'm weighing tactically, well, wait, how many signatures are they really going to get us versus some, bilingual channel that may have like 10,000 viewers on that one might be way more valuable.
It's true.
Because that could get us more signatures. So I'm thinking super tactically about all this stuff. And I mean, if developers are on board, great. But I mean, I'll talk to them if they want to have sane conversations like this about it. But just targeting them, I'm not sure how much that really changes the calculus on this. Because let's say we get 20 developers on board with this, but then we only get 10,000 more signatures. Nothing changed. But now Damian's more optimistic, but that's how I'm looking at it. So.
Yeah, so what I wanted to say, Joey, is that you're exactly right. Like, you can't really, in earnest, try to criticize Stop Calling Games without having actually tried to think your way through some of the scenarios, like, in earnest. We are really wishing for, like, high-level opposition with, like, really good arguments. We're not getting that. We are simply not getting high quality counter arguments. The the thing that you said about, trying to break through the surface level, no one's really tried that. Anytime I see criticism, it's like, some sort of like very simple, very, default internet disagreement kind of argument.
Well, we're trying to
And
have
we
a
are
discussion in an era of talking points, right?
exactly, and we are really struggling to find really good, really high quality detractors, for lack of better word. And we would love to have them, but we don't. And if you want to be a good Stop Killing Games detractor, sit down and really work it out as a games developer. How would you do this? Like, if you really were forced to, and you really wanted to, and you wanted to do like the very best job of meeting Stop Killing Games demands, what could you do? And like, really sit down, think about this for like, a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. Think about it, write down things on paper, like, whip out the spreadsheet, do all of that stuff.
That's what it's
But
going to come
don't
down
come
to,
at
yeah.
us like, yeah, but don't come at us like, well, I'm just not gonna sign. Like, that's not
Well,
a great argument.
okay, but maybe Damian's looking for all these high profile detractors. I'm not personally. My stance on this is the European Citizens Initiative and the consumer action is the best possible chance, the best possible solution I could come up with the reality that we have. My personal stance is I am in favor of any solution that solves this problem. And actually, I think that does create some friction with some people because then it's saying, okay, we can do this any way you want to as long as we save the games. So when the reaction to that is, no, we can't do this, well, I mean, where do you go from there? It's kind of like, okay, if there's nothing we can do, well, I disagree on that.
I think everything that you've talked about, especially with me directly, right? Because then I can actually hear your response to it. It's helped a lot, but I'm still. I should have said this at the start of the video or something maybe, but my biggest worry. I support the initiative. I support the goal, but I'm worried that there will be an increase in development costs that will be passed on to the consumer in a lot of cases, and I live in Poland. I think, people around here live in similar locations where the cost of games it's not the most friendly compared to the amount that you make annually, right? And
Yeah.
that increase in games
Well,
scares me.
Well, luckily enough, uh, even if there is an increase in the cost of game development, which I disagree with, by the way, but even if there is, then luckily enough for developers, games have just gone up in price from $60 to $70. Plus, after those $70, you also pay the pre-order, which is an additional like $30. Plus, you also pay for the premium pack, which is another $20. Plus, you pay for the season 1
That's not a
battle
good
pass, which
thing.
is $10,
How is this a
right?
good thing? This
So
sucks.
what I'm
Developers.
trying to say is games have recently increased in price by 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and they have not increased in price because of additional costs, because we all know that both the game programmers, the 3D artists, the voice actors, the game testers, the server admins, they're not getting paid more. They're getting paid less. And they're being made redundant all the time so that they can't get any stock. What's
I
happening is
I disagree
And
that the
also,
cost isn't increasing. The cost
what
is
we need to
increasing
remember,
games.
no. The cost
yeah.
is increasing. The cost is increasing, but it's not going to the right people.
I agree
And what
with
I'm
that.
trying to say is that the price of games is not increasing because of the cost increasing. The price of games is increasing because game companies aren't happy with a lot of money. They want to have all of the money. And that's the difference.
Well,
That's why
it's still the
games
cost of
cost more and more.
development. It's just the cost of personnel, which are two
And the
separate
other thing,
things.
we're only
Well, not
talking
just.
about games with an online only requirement too.
Yes.
So I don't know how you spin this into saying, like, what you have Baldur's Gate 3 coming out, not long ago, or just pretty much any game that sold on GOG or that just doesn't require you to connect to the publisher when it goes down. I don't see why it would increase the cost for those. So because they're already compliant.
There's a very minor issue where games that have matchmaking that's done through Steamworks, there may be cases where that SKG could interfere with that a little bit, but that I don't want to talk about that today because it's something that is so minor that can be solved very easily that it doesn't. It's not really a point to bring up.
Yeah. So I think the important thing to say here is that what we're dealing with here is either companies that are so huge that the increase in cost of initial capital expense just doesn't calculate into their running costs because their operational expenses are just so much higher.
Yeah, it's negligible.
For like live service games. Yeah. So in that case, if your servers cost like $500,000 per month, then having to have a developer, run a binary build and maintain it, that costs like $40,000 a year of his time. That's absolutely nothing. On the other hand, if we have like smaller games that are always online just to be always online as a version of DRM, then you gotta say, that's something that the companies are doing to themselves at that point, right? They are actively reaching for that solution. No one's forcing them to do that. They are reaching for that because they think that it will solve piracy, which it won't.
Well,
And then
it can be effective.
Trying to solve piracy
you
is
know,
stupid.
I
have a very minority opinion as a game developer that I don't give a shit about piracy. In fact, I just hope you like the game and that maybe it goes on sale at some point and that you can afford it then.
Yeah, I mean, the only really good way of stopping piracy is something like the Nuvo, which only like 2 people in the world know how to crack. One of them is insane and the other is a criminal. And it's
A lot of the games,
there's not a lot of people who can crack this.
The best way to solve
yeah.
privacy is to make a good game.
go down. Look, games that don't get pirated often die, and that's kind of the issue with the online only games. I mean, there's hundreds of titles that are basically unplayable, even if you have the client, because nobody bothered to reverse engineer a server emulator, which I don't even want to think about how much work that is. I mean, it is quite effective at piracy. I mean, The Crew never got pirated. Like as an example. Same for The Crew 2. Same for The Crew Motorfest.
Yeah, exactly. Games where the servers are actually in some way functional, that's a good anti-piracy measure.
But
right?
How many people might have bought
like
The Crew
half
if they
the game
could try it out, right? I pirate games, and you know why I do it? It's because it's a lot of money for me to buy games, and sometimes I want to try the game first before I buy it.
Yeah, but the point is, no, this actually is, I think it's more effective against piracy than not. Like this practice of basically withholding the server component, keeping it there, shutting it down so the customer never has it, and then they have a bricked game at the end. So yeah, you solve piracy, but then the customer got robbed. So
yeah, like if the cost of doing business is scamming the other side of the business deal, then maybe you should be doing your business in jail. Ultimately, right?
I can't disagree. I'm tired of these suits who don't give a shit about games or gamers making horrible decisions that not only fuck over the gamers, but they mess with the developers too. A lot of them who care a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is ultimately it, right? Clawing back your rights from a bunch of suits who just don't care. And I would say, even if you don't give a fuck about games, if you don't give a fuck about keeping games, or if you think that games should die the moment they are taken offline, a good argument for you to sign Stop Killing Games is still that this is something that Bobby Kotick wouldn't want you to do. and that's enough for myself. You know, for me, that's enough.
It's a good
That's
argument.
something Bobby Kotick doesn't want you to do, and that's it. That's that's it. Like personally, I don't pirate games. I have. Let me look it up. Profile, just on Steam, I have 3,814 games owned, 2,601 DLC owned, and 1,368 still on the wish list.
I can say a game I
So
recently pirated was Shapes 2, like a puzzle game. It's like, well, there's no demo for this. I want to see if I like it. Played it for 2 hours, loved it, purchased it. And I think that Steam Next Fest is actually a very good deterrent to that, because now it's an event that I get to try people's games before they're out. And demos before Steam Next Fest, they were getting rarer and rarer and more rare.
yeah,
Now they're super
Maybe-
I
common
mean
again.
that's cool.
You wanted to do the live questions, or were there?
Yeah, there were
any
a couple questions.
last-minute ones?
I don't want to keep you guys for too long. So Lexi asked, and I think we covered this, but we can reiterate it. What about games sold individually that then also require a subscription? Base example being WoW was originally sold with physical copies, and you purchase the game and the subscription separately. Would this just be perfectly fine, and devs could turn into a submodel as long as it is in the EULA, just to get out of this proposition? So I think I also mentioned that, where while a developer can just change their game into a subscription model before end of life, and that
Yeah,
might be
but
a
this
loophole.
is different. Like the WoW case, where you bought the game, but that came with what 60 days of access, and then that's one we're talking about a grayer area. But I think this is an example where we might not win on that, just because you can. Actually, I think what would happen would be they would stop selling like the box copies of it as though it is a good, and just simply sell it saying 60-day subscription to the game. I think that's an example where clear labeling probably would be the most likely outcome, because you can definitely spin that as a service, and so I think that's what would probably come from that. But
Yeah, like all the people complaining about, oh, we want to make WoW a single player game or whatever, they don't realize that WoW simply wouldn't fall under Stop Killing Games. And I don't know if EVE Online would, but probably not. Unless, suddenly games where you also buy microtransactions like Horse Armor or whatever fall under Stop Killing Games, which is something that the EU could do, but who knows?
there's so few games that use that model, because most people don't want to pay money every month for their game. So it's only the old guard
Yeah,
big dogs that are able to get away with this for the most part.
like WoW, Final Fantasy, RuneScape.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay, another question was from Mignol. If this applies to games with microtransactions, what about consumables? Do those count as goods we're entitled to?
I think that yeah, I've been asked about this. I think it all comes back to how it's sold. So if it's a consumable, but you don't have an expiration date, it sounds like a good. But if it's a consumable and you have to use it within 3 months or something like that, well, then that sounds more like a service, because you're putting a hard time cap on it, and that's how services tend to work. So
Yeah,
yeah, it all depends on how it's sold.
we covered goods and services earlier, and I think that's something that we would all like to see more thoroughly defined by some sort of official committee.
I think you're going to get your wish on that, or in some form.
I'm intrigued. I'm a developer, so I'm still a little bit scared. But my company, I think we mentioned this privately, but I don't plan to make any live service games, so it doesn't impact me. But I'm
Really
still a
not
little scared.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, very few people do. Like, you gotta understand, like, people complaining about this are like an extremely vocal, extremely visible minority of people who have, in some cases, they grew up walking around on all fours with a diaper on in Blizzard offices. I mean, you couldn't indoctrinate someone better than that. So you have to think about like people complaining about this stuff. usually have like a very big, very vested interest, and there's very few of them.
Well, also, if you want to get an, I'm a bit biased here, but I think a lot of the biggest detractors are probably not citizens of European Union countries for the most part. Like a lot of Americans, maybe some Australians they're less accustomed to expecting consumer rights. So like if you want to get a real idea of what the reactions are, look at like German or French coverage of this and just kind of go through the comments and maybe translate and see how many are negative or how many are positive or neutral, that sort of thing. I think those will give you more realistic numbers, at least in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you can even go to like the American content creators, look at their comment sections, and they're still flooded with people who support stop-gun games because simply
Well,
no one sees
there's a lot of
anything else
Europeans that
sensible.
watch these content creators.
I
I mean,
think unfortunately, I
Yeah.
think our biggest block of people are ones that are either unaware of this or just apathetic. Yeah, whatever. They don't care either way.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that's the majority of people.
Well, if
But
you
in one
think
of those
that a
cases,
game during its heyday has 20,000 concurrent players, right? And by the time that it's dead, it has 200. I mean, you have, a significant number of those players who have, in a lot of cases, probably just forgotten or moved on. So they don't want to save the game because they're not playing the game anymore, and that's
they
pretty
forgot
sad.
about it. Yeah, that's the conundrum. That's why this is such an uphill battle.
Yeah.
Just psychologically, like getting people interested in it, explaining it, just getting the government to understand it, everything.
Getting the government to understand anything regarding video games is a battle that I don't want to find myself in.
That's honestly why I never did any action prior to this to the crew, because the crew was like not the perfect candidate, but a damn good one, because it was a what I call a clean kill. So, like Destiny 2, that's a huge game where like a lot of people had content removed from them from the DLC.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck trying to explain that to a government bureaucrat. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, to the
Like,
80-year-old
Yeah,
career politician.
we needed like a high visibility event. It's
or,
like
or
what Alfred Hitchcock said about what a good movie is like. He said in the first scene, a volcano erupts, and then the tension just keeps getting higher. And that's what we needed. We needed that volcano to erupt, and well, thank you, Ubisoft.
He was the master of
good
tension
game.
and suspension.
Yeah.
I think the crew too was something that one thing I didn't realize at first when I was reacting to your videos, Ross, was that it had an offline mode that was discovered in the files.
oh yeah, I even opened the exe up in a hex editor to check. It's there. Yeah.
And once I realized that, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is this is just absurd. Like, why can't they just release that?
That's just a bonus, though. I mean, another big candidate which had been problematic would have been Overwatch, because that's from an American company. Now they do have a European distributor, but then trying to get the laws sorted out as to whether they're liable or not in the EU, that would have been a nightmare. Plus, they released Overwatch 2 for free and gave some benefits to the owners of Overwatch 1. So that complicates the whole mess. That's not a clean kill then. That's like,
And their
maybe
distributor
compensate.
was in Switzerland as well, right?
Yes, which has
Jesus.
some overlap with EU laws, but then it's not 100%. So that would have just been a nightmare. So
Yeah.
it's almost had to come from Ubisoft because they're just,
They know how to do it.
yeah. Well, no, it's like they were doing what all these other companies were doing, except they're in France. So that's the big
Yeah, I
difference.
mean, Ubisoft is probably the only huge corporation that pissed off this many people that is in France and still hasn't had a track of manure dumped at their footstep, which is just they are enjoying every single benefit and they just don't respect it.
Well, not anymore, but I think that's less because of us and more because of internal stuff. Like,
replacing the CEO.
Yeah.
I
Well, who
heard a
knows? I mean,
rumor, Ross, that you didn't actually want to get into you didn't want to really be the face of this initially. I don't know if that's true or not, though.
That's not a rumor. I've said that
Oh,
yeah.
multiple times. Like I in multiple videos for at least 5 years, I'm saying that like, I'm not the best person to handle this. Right? Somebody more knowledgeable or has more free time or experience in this sort of thing would be better. I'd be better as just kind of like a mascot, kind of signal boosting. That never happened. And then in earlier this year, I was saying, if somebody else can like really helps or think you do know what you're doing. So it's just, again, it was that feeling that it, I had that feeling that if there's a chance that if I do this, I could fix it. But if I don't do this, it's never going to get fixed. And that would just drive me insane. So that's what it's the
Yeah,
motivation.
I think
I didn't want to be doing any of this.
I think if you want to change something like in the world, you have to find someone who is this passionate, who is
yes.
as passionate as Ross is. And like it would drive him mad if he didn't do it. And that's the level of passion that's at least necessary in
Yeah,
order
but
to change something.
that
Right?
doesn't mean I wanted to do it. See, you mentioned the
Yeah.
25 years. Yeah, for like the first 15 years or so, I kept hoping, okay, government would eventually catch up and have sane laws on this and like realize, okay, this is a problem. So initially I was just trying to create awareness of this. Like, okay, maybe just
Yeah.
enough people don't realize this is what's happening. And then they realize, no, okay, just nobody's just doing anything. All right.
You just got
Yeah,
more cynical as you got older.
oh, absolutely. But I was always kind of cynical. That doesn't change too
Par for the
much.
course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but Ross works like he's in the mines literally every day with his head down, working for like sometimes 15 hours a day. Like he's burning the candle on like 5 ends, you
The
know?
past 2 weeks, it's gone down way much. I've actually had time to play
Yeah.
games again.
That's
That's
good, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
you say that, and
Yeah,
it's
but
like
that's
that's
like
the same thing I complain about with game developers. It's it's
but
like
it
you're
was
burning
like that
yourself
for
out.
months. It was like that
yeah,
for months. Yes.
yeah, but that's like 2 weeks after like half a year or something like that,
Jesus,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, so you do have to be
Well,
passionate. Like
on
I'm
that note,
lucky we
are
have
there
this
any
guy.
last questions we should answer so I can go and have
Yeah,
fun?
yeah. I'll let you guys get going. If by the way, if
Lay
there
down.
we can do maybe two more. Okay, so if there's any questions you want to ask, throw it in here now. We'll try to keep it short. We love to yap apparently, and
Okay, somebody's
I mean,
asking
we
about
can always do another one.
that's true.
yeah,
That's true. If there's
someone's
anything more to
asking about
talk,
free-to-play games. We answered that earlier. The short version is if the game's truly free, no. If it has microtransactions, there's a high chance it could be impacted because of how they're sold. Because they're a one-time purchase with no expiration date, which could be seen as a service, but we'll find out. See, I think I saw some other questions.
there was a lot of discussion as we were going on, and I didn't want to interrupt. Um, but I don't know if there's anything that anybody has, put it here. If there's maybe comments in the YouTube, because every single time I talk about stop killing games, my comments are lit on fire. And so maybe there's some discussion that we can have another time based upon those if things are brought up. But if not, I think this is a good place to call it. And I just want to thank both of you,
Okay,
Ross
I
and
see
Damian.
one. Somebody's saying, oh yeah, if somebody paid $50 for a game and played it for 200 hours, the company could say, well, they got their value, we owe them nothing. And the officer could
But
find that
the
agreeable.
bankruptcy officer.
This is not how the law works. If you buy a book and you've read it like 50 times, do they get to decide that, okay, you got your money's worth? It's, and another thing I saw in the comments earlier, people were talking about like, oh, they're renting this to you. Well, no, that's not really it, because if they were renting things to us, they would tell us how long it lasts. See, that's the key distinction. They don't like to do that for the most part. So.
That's a good point.
Let's see. Somebody's saying not about the item purchased, but the items earned by playing completely for free. I think actually not, because if you have a free to play game, and you play it and grind and get some stuff, but then you never put 1 cent into that, well, then there's no financial transaction. So I'm not sure you would be entitled to the game at that point when it's shut down or stop killing games. So yeah, you'd have to buy like a $2 skin or something to have.
Well, the underlying problem here is legally that your time invested into something is not viewed in general as payment for something. So no matter how much time you invest into something, you still haven't bought it. And some people are kind of upset about this because this has become the way for a lot of people to do business, where they have you basically doing free work inside of their game. Because essentially, something like, say, EVE Online, Apex Legends, whatever, right? It's also attractive, not just because of the work that the developer is doing, but because there are other human players there, right? So philosophically, in some way, you are providing value to the company by playing their game. But legally, this is not being recognized at all. But this is also not a problem that Stop Killing Games is trying to solve. And it's not even known if this is a real problem or if this is something that should just be accepted, right? This is like a huge open question.
Yeah, I mean, it. If you ever get lost, just try to apply the practice of what's going on in the games now to any other good or service, and that'll give you like a clue as to like how to treat this. Like with the Netflix rent. Let's say it is a service, so the Netflix rental. Well, what if you watched one movie on it for the whole month and that's it? You didn't really get your money's worth. Versus what if you watched every single day nothing but movies on it the whole time? Well, it's the same service that was sold to you either way. It doesn't really. Or actually, for single versus multiplayer, I don't think there's any legal distinction between those two for how it's sold. So sometimes gamer brains are kind of tuned towards different ways that the law doesn't really care about. So we're coming at this much more from a consumer rights perspective. All this stuff.
Yeah, I mean the conversation about games is very well controlled by game companies, right? So a lot of the
True.
nomenclature,
Yeah.
a lot of the ways in which we think about games, that all comes from the game companies themselves. So it's not unusual that gamers will also end up thinking in terms that are dictated by those companies.
Well, it's a lot of psychological bullshit too. I mean, with anchoring and monetization design.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you don't want to see this, make sure Stop Killing Games succeeds, and
Yes.
then might be the next step. Who knows? We'll see.
Gamers
Right?
rise up.
A million
Yes.
people can change a lot of things.
Well, I mean, it's the
StopKillingGames.com.
yeah, stopkillinggames.com, and you can also go
Yeah.
to AccursedFarms. That's Ross's YouTube channel to watch his video FAQs, and I'm sure you'll be doing more of that, right?
A lot of that is more just my regular kind of goofy videos that have nothing to do with this. This is for Accursed Farms. That's what I plan to get back to. But to go in here, go as hard as I can to be done, and whatever happens,
Can't blame you,
happens.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, one day, maybe like 10 years from now, you can start rewatching the old videos and do like a Ross's Mind series.
No. Let's keep moving. New stuff.
Guys, I
All
don't
right, I
want
think that's
to.
it for me.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you two any longer. So if there's nothing else, we can wrap this up and get some sleep, right?
Yeah, thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to everyone going to the Stop Killing Games website, contributing. If you would like to in some way support Stop Killing Games, but you are not in Europe, in the EU, or you cannot sign, or you've already signed and you want to support still, just spread the word. Go to your favorite YouTubers, tell them
Small
about it.
channels or small and medium YouTube channels and streamers, that sort of thing. That
You know, go on Reddit, go on TikTok, tell people about it, because that's where it happens. It doesn't happen on, like, you know, big magazine interviews and stuff like that. It happens by word of mouth.
Yeah, keep the
So,
discussion going.
yeah.
all right. I think I'm out.
Damian, Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for your time.
It's been exceptional, guys. I'm uploading this to YouTube right after, so if you missed any part of it, you can check it out there. Fully unedited. It's just going to be dumped on there because I don't have time to edit. So thank you so much for watching, and see you guys on Monday for more of our development stuff. Take care, guys. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.